Against Mason and Josephus by Jonathan Mactemus, an OBRY Project book review, critique, and commentary. This, the first on Josephus in the New Testament by Steve Mason. Introduction. The OBRY Project's first official review of any singular contemporary work, this book review of Josephus in the New Testament, authored by Steve Mason, offers the reader a fresh perspective on biblical learning. The reason for undertaking book reviews in general is to offer the novel perspective a reviewer can bring to the act of critically assessing the work of another, and the OBRY Project brings a perspective unlike that of any other, a fresh, non-establishment perspective, intent on refraining from playing the academic's tired old game. Academia relies on circular, peer-reviewed materials and arguments. There's never enough criticism of them nor by them to cause the vulgar peasant to become skeptical of the entire system, the academic's fortress. What we need is absolute, uncompromising honesty. In this case, concerning our true history. Those who are willing to apply pressure to the academics in the form of exacting criticism will begin to hold them, at long last, appropriately accountable. Subsequently, the OBRY Project is resolved to no longer leave the facts regarding our true history in the hands of anyone willing to play the establishment academics' game. This review will likely prove longer than if it were merely a review or merely a review of Mason alone, as the subject matter of the book, apart from Mason's work, demands attention, which necessarily added to its length and level of detail. Therefore, this is not simply a review of Mason's book, nor of Mason himself, but also of the works credited to one Flavius Josephus. Going beyond Mason in my criticism is due primarily to the heavy dependence of mainstream and religious scholarship on the works of Josephus, namely, the 4 books comprising The Jewish War, Jewish Antiquities, Life, and Against Apion. These works, as well as a number of others regarded as contemporary or supportive of them, have had a greater than profound effect on our understanding of history in general and biblical facts in particular. It is my aim and hope that this review and critique will be a sharp and accurate tool in everyone's historical literary kit. Book details. Josephus in the New Testament, 2nd edition by author Steve Mason. Copyright 2003. ISBN 1-56563-795-X. Hendrickson Publishers, LLC, P.O. Box 3473, Peabody, Massachusetts, 01961-3473. Hendrickson Publishers, according to their own account, began in 1980 with the publication of The Works of Josephus, translated by William Whiston, who is said to have translated the works over 300 years ago. They also specialize in the printing of King James Bibles and Bible study materials, and have acquired Rose Publications, allegedly started in 1991 by a mother-daughter team, a Sunday school teacher and public school teacher, respectively. Their stated goal was to provide more useful visual charts and graphics for Bible students. The few I've seen appear to be reinforcements of the biblical status quo. They do not tell us if the founder's name actually was Rose, which would be useful considering the prolific use of the rose symbolism by groups neither with open nor altruistic motives. The full red flower perhaps typifying a sweet, perfumed countenance with bitter thorns lurking beneath. The softcover book I purchased is approximately 5.5 inches wide by 8.5 inches tall and 3/16 of an inch thick. Including its introduction and indexes, it spans 318 pages of mostly 12-point serif font. The front cover, back cover, and spine are a dark blue with colored images of purported old coins on the front, the title and publisher's name on the spine, and standard promotions in the forms of 1. A brief bio, 2. Another promotion of Josephus, and 3. 2 reviews promoting both Josephus and Mason on the back. The back cover reads, quote, Steve Mason is a professor of humanities at Vanier College, York University, Ontario. He is the author of Flavius Josephus on the Pharisees, a composition critical study, and the general editor of Flavius Josephus, translation and commentary, closed quote. It is clearly not a stretch to conclude that both Hendrickson and Mason may have financial reasons for promoting Flavius Josephus as a viable historical religious source, and, perhaps analogous to those working within the realm of Sub Rosa, they may have motives beyond mere money for keeping the materials of Josephus and like publications alive in our conscious and subconscious minds. As we will see, Josephus is filled with implications and has a usefulness to the establishment that goes well beyond his questionable records. Overview. I bought this book after hearing an interview of the author, Mason, comparing the works of Josephus to the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Therefore, I had it in my head that the book would mainly consist of the same comparison, only to be disappointed to find instead a long and detailed apology for the writings of Josephus. What I encountered more often than not was a message cutting through that could very well have read, though Josephus is contradictory, often confusing, and of a low moral character, this should not dissuade anyone from considering still the works of Josephus as a viable historical religious source. For the greater sum of the book, the contrasts and comparisons of Josephus and the New Testament are quite sparse. The main thrust appears to be a defense of Josephus and other establishment-approved historians. Only a fraction of the total book is dedicated to some real meat concerning what Josephus and specifically Luke Acts have in common. If you want to read a book that focuses on these New Testament parallels or disparities, this may not be for you. If you want a book that provides mainly condensations of the works of Josephus, such as are in accordance with other establishment-approved histories and a real feel-good reason to keep reading and believing in the works of Josephus, then this book is perfectly suited. Book Index. Preface to the second edition, Roman numeral 9. Abbreviations, Roman numeral 13. Introduction. The purpose of this book, page 1. Chapter 1, The Use and Abuse of Josephus, page 7. Chapter 2, The Career of Josephus, page 35. Chapter 3, The Writings of Josephus, page 55. Chapter 4, Who's Who in the New Testament World, page 147. Chapter 5, Early Christian Figures Mentioned by Josephus, page 213. Chapter 6, Josephus and Luke Acts, page 251. Conclusion, The Significance of Josephus for New Testament Study, page 297. Index of Subjects, page 303, and Index of Ancient Sources, page 309. Highlights of Preface to the Second Edition. The lion's share of content in this brief section is spent on Mason's recollection of Josephan study historically, citing how the intense study of Josephus has grown greatly in our time since the 1980s. It should be noted that Hendrickson publishers got fully behind the works of Josephus in the 1980s. Highlights of Introduction. On page 2, Mason begins with insights about the body of work commonly credited to purported first-century Jewish author Flavius Josephus, the implications of which should not be underestimated. In addition to citing that Josephus would have been a contemporary of the authors of the New Testament, Mason writes, quote, They, being the writings of Josephus, are a resource whose value for New Testament study is not even remotely paralleled in another contemporary author. If his writing had not survived, Bible dictionaries would all be pocketbook size, and textbooks on the background of the New Testament would have little to tell us, closed quote. He goes on, quote, Josephus has been the archaeologist's constant companion, suggesting where to look and how to interpret what is found, closed quote. For the sake of emphasis, I will restate what was just cited. No literature outside of the Bible has had such a marked influence on our understanding of the Bible, its history, culture, terminology, and geography, as have the writings of Josephus. This point must be constantly recalled going forward. On page 3, Mason gives us a brief history of the study of Josephus's works in the modern age, as in the last few centuries, with special emphasis on the English translation of William Whiston, circa 1737. Although Mason frequently uses Josephian translations that better suit his ends, I will be citing only the Whiston translation for Josephus on account of Whiston being the standard English translation. In addition, I will be citing the World English Bible with limited Hebrew, or more appropriately, OBRY transliterations for Bible passages. This is largely due to the World English Bible's readability, and like the KJV, it also is in the public domain. Turning back to Mason, he then recounts the 4 known works of Josephus from the previous page: Jewish War, Jewish Antiquities, Life, and Against Appian. He notes the, in my following opinion, rambling, reader-traumatizing style in Josephus's writings, and how the Antiquities are commonly referred to as a paraphrase of the Old Testament, which suggests that Antiquities and Josephus are pro-Old Testament. Josephus even claims to be writing Antiquities for the sake of truth and accuracy in his introduction to the book. As unfortunate as it is for the sincere reader of Josephus, the term paraphrase is widely defined as either a clarification of a former text or, and perhaps more significantly, an adaptation and alteration of that text. It becomes clear which definition fits Mason's use of paraphrase, when Josephus cannot even make it past the first page of Antiquities without asserting, for one, that Genesis 2:4 forward is a philosophical commentary by Moses. Moses apparently claims that, quote, God took dust from the ground and formed man, and inserted in him a spirit and a soul, closed quote, thereby reducing Genesis 2:4 to subjective speculation and immediately suggesting that Moses was a Trinitarian. Not to mention what this says about Josephus's particular leaning. The actual passage in question, however, indicates nothing of the sort when it reads, quote, Yahweh, or Lord, Elohim, or God, formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Close quote. Genesis 2:7. In the actual biblical text, it is the ruch, translated breath or spirit, entering man that causes him to become a nepesh hieh, translated living soul. These are not presented as equal components existing distinctly within a thing, making up a whole, but a component added to a thing and thereby making a new singular entity, a nepesh hieh. Thus, man made of dust plus spirit breath equals living soul. The same words, nepesh hieh, are used in Genesis 1 to describe various wildlife. Quote, Elohim, God, created the large sea creatures and every living creature, nepesh hieh, that moves, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind. Closed quote, Genesis 1:21. Surely, Josephus cannot believe the great whales and such similar creatures were triune beings as well. There are many Bible scholars who will readily deride radical translations and commentaries of the Bible as full of malicious intent, but it appears the same critical eye is not applied nearly often enough to Josephus's Antiquities. The next 2 pages are summaries of chapters to come and end on page 6, where Mason writes, quote, "If we try to understand him, Josephus, as a real person from the first century Jewish world, our reading of the Christian scriptures will at least be greatly enriched, if not radically changed." Closed quote. My immediate response is, but isn't he already widely assumed to be a real person from the first century Jewish world? Why do I need to exert myself and try to understand him as such? Are there any truthful, reliable, and objective sources that also require my best effort to believe their veracity? Won't the truth show itself regardless of my efforts for or against it? Let us keep this obvious bias that Mason reveals in mind throughout. He needs us to understand Josephus as a real person, for if we do, as it's suggested by Mason, we will then allow these works to influence our reading and understanding of the Christian scriptures as well as the Old Testament. And then I wonder if the admonition not to add to or detract from the law was not merely in letter and word, but also in concept and perception. Quote, "You shall not add to the word which I command you, neither shall you take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your Aleh, which I command you." Closed quote. Deuteronomy 4:2. Highlights of Chapter 1, The Use and Abuse of Josephus. Here Mason details the misapplication of Josephus's works, according to him, and mainly perpetrated by Christians, as no one, including Mason, is ever inclined to openly attack Jews, celebrated historians, or ancient establishment-approved works. He focuses mainly on the abuse of the works of Josephus and Jews in general by those horrible Christians. However, in order to squarely blame the Christians, we must forget what he wrote on page 3. Quote, "And no matter how good the translation, the substance of Josephus remains a challenge to the most curious investigator." Closed quote. From this, I would suppose the fault of misuse or abuse rested upon either Josephus or his translators, rather than with the interpreters. After all, if one hands a man a banana and tells him to drive a nail with it, is it reasonable when they then berate him for not accomplishing that goal? On page 8, Mason begins his long trail of citing the Ancients, which is the bulwark of all modern academics. This, on its surface, has the effect of lending weight to Josephus, and is effective only until one pursues serious studies of these ancients, thus finding them either ridiculously comical or obviously derivative of other comical accounts. He names figures such as Eusebius, Origen, and later Jerome, which, as we can see from many other examples by Mason, do not agree with Josephus or one another regarding enough critical points as to make the wide-eyed reader justifiably suspicious of all these ancient authors. Indeed, there are a number of these ancient establishment-approved authors who do seem to either validate the existence of Josephus or contain data in harmony with Josephus. But what do we really know that is truly without doubt about these ancient sources? One thing we do know by their respective writings is that all follow suit with Josephus, making the Law and Prophets, as well as Christianity, on par with Greco-Roman philosophy and religion. The actual Law and Prophets, i.e. the Old Testament, is nothing of the sort. Instead, it is law, creation, maintenance, design, covenants, history, prophecy, and relationship to the one who conceived and maintains all manifested, predominantly in his interactions with specific created beings. This circular pattern of citation and concepts, a typical feature among these ancients, especially in light of their often erroneous nature, is not only peculiar in itself, but also peculiar in the way in which these references still hold so much lofty nobility with academics to this day. One of the most difficult issues with these sources, besides their often incredulous claims and disagreements, is how one may absolutely verify their earliest publication and the authenticity of surviving pre-publication manuscripts. The majority of all texts are cited as published no earlier than the 16th century CE, and many are cited as published centuries later. These publication claims tend to exist as official government data, such as in the Library of Congress catalog and similar catalogs of other nations. Private, unbiased, second or third sources outside of official edict are remarkably difficult to establish. If there were even an air of reliability or congruity about them, there would be less to question. But all one must do is acquire a copy of any of these ancient sources and read them for oneself to witness their radiating incredulity, their recurrent disagreement, and their frequently insulting absurdity, i.e. the gold-hoarding cyclops and griffins of the father of history, Herodotus. The mere fact that so many academics treat these ancients as reliable in any way speaks volumes about either their lack of discernment and willingness to ignore the obvious, or, to be very frank, their complicity in this fraud. Mason begins to tell us on page 9 the importance of Josephus to a Christian audience. In paragraph 1, he asserts, quote, "His writings provided extraordinary background information for the reader of early Christian writings, especially the Gospels," closed quote. And, quote, "They filled in a vast amount of history between the close of the Old Testament and the birth of Christianity," closed quote. Mason names these few sparse characters shared between Josephus and the New Testament, but as we will see, besides commonly shared names, not much between these sources actually agree. We will also see these trivial mentions are arguably not nearly good enough reasons to invest such time and energy into forcing oneself to believe Josephus was, as Mason uncomfortably framed it, a real person. He goes on to cite Josephus's importance to the Crusades by revealing the geography of Palestine to the Crusaders, though we will see later that Mason admits that both Josephus and Luke Acts get Palestinian geography wrong. Mason insists that the use of Josephus by Crusaders was one of history's paradoxes, in how, on the one hand, Crusaders venerated his writings, and on the other, as Mason opines, quote, "It created no dissonance for them to stop and root and butcher Josephus's co-religionists, the men, women, and children of Europe's Jewish communities, for being," quote, "Christ killers," closed quote. And here, I certainly cannot refrain from commenting on the hypocrisy Mason is perpetuating via this trope about Christians, since no practicing Christian I've ever even been aware of has ever treated a Jew in this manner, while nearly every Jew I've ever been aware of wails endlessly at the injustice of what they say are tropes concerning themselves, while in practical reality their actions prove them to be characteristics rather than tropes. I also find it odd that Mason never misses a chance to demonize Christians, accusing them of unprovoked violence against Jews. If he's read all the sources he uses to validate Josephus, he'd find prolific Jew on Christian, Jew on Jew, and Christian on Christian violence. Somehow, In Mason's mind, the alleged Christian on Jew aggression is the most noteworthy. Additionally, one must wonder if Mason paid attention to all the times Josephus affirmed Jews as a race, as in a people defined by specific genes, in contrast to merely those of a religion. If there is any great paradox present, as Mason claims, it is the way both Josephus and Mason get to make the Jews a race or a religion, depending on when it best suits their end. Perhaps Josephus's geographical offerings to the Crusaders accounts for Mason's parenthetical, quote, "The Crusaders were ultimately unsuccessful," closed quote. Or perhaps the Crusaders were too tired from all that land travel and killing along the way when they could have just sailed there. Ships and boats existed then and weren't difficult to manufacture. What an amazingly unnecessary expenditure of time, energy, and resources on the part of those mysterious crusaders, not to mention how bizarre a thing it is to imagine them expending such malicious fervor, thereby only weakening their means, which I'm told they would desperately need against the actual enemy they were going to fight, i.e., the Arab Muslims. Mason also perhaps inadvertently begins to give us the true substance behind Josephus's popularization by the mainstream, though he continually inserts Christianity as those so desirous of Josephan works. He would frame it as though the common Christian was the one clamoring away for Josephus until the establishment just had to give in and widely publish him, or it, or them. Mason writes on page 10 that Josephus claims concerning Christianity how, quote, "this new faith had neither a national center nor an ethnic character," closed quote. And then on page 11, quote, "Josephus was indirectly helpful to the young church on this score because he had faced something of the same animosity towards his nation and religion," closed quote. And these two quotes, a page apart, become so bizarre when read in sequence. On the one hand, Josephus criticizes and contrasts Christianity to Judaism, and on the other, Mason claims him to be sympathetic to Christianity by using a polar opposite comparison. We see a very subtle flip-flopping between the ideas that either Judaism or Christianity is at once a race and at once a religion. This is a phenomenon laced throughout all aforementioned ancients. It's a shell game. Will the pea be under the religion shell this time or under the race shell? Just before this, Mason writes, quote, "what he," Josephus, actually says in explanation and defense of Judaism is a consistent feature of the Christian misuse of Josephus, closed quote. I tend to agree, but only slightly and in the following way. Anyone who supports evangelical, multicultural Christianity is not misusing Josephus at all, as just seen in the previous quotes. The works of Josephus present Judaism, a thoroughly non-biblical term, as both a philosophy and religion, fleshed out by Josephus among others with not a few Hellenistic paradigm shifts. This pernicious point of view is both consistently compatible with evangelical Christianity, namely modern popular Christianity, and consistently incompatible to the actual information found in the Law and Prophets, again, the Old Testament. We see a very convoluted proposition. Josephus misrepresents the foundations of Christianity, that being the Old Testament viewed through his opinions as found in Antiquities and War, but, according to Mason, Christians are the ones who are misusing. I believe the strongest argument that can be made for opposing the use of Josephus by Christians is found throughout this book in Mason's repetitious claims of Christians misusing Josephus. I also do think Christians misuse Josephus, but unlike Mason, I think they misuse it by actually using it for anything more than criticism or examination of an adversarial text. The very real paradox of Christians venerating a book so detrimental to their own understanding of everything biblical and thus their well-being is, in my opinion, even greater than Mason's claims about what happened en route to the Crusades. On page 12 through 19, Mason now convinces us of the wrong thinking of Christians who believe and or agree that the destruction of the temple, along with those in it and in Jerusalem, as described by Josephus, was justified as a national judgment of the JEWS. First, the biblical tribe of Judah and nation of Israel is not now nor ever was kindred to the modern Ashkenazim Jews, not provably. No modern Jews, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, or Mizrahim, bear the marks or signs of biblical Israel, Judah. Mason, and I can't stress this enough, must know that we are talking about the judgment of Judah, transliterated in the Koine New Testament, Judah, from the so-called Hebrew Yudeh. His incessant use of Jew, as though there actually were overwhelming evidence of the two being the same, should be an additional clue to where his biases stand. Even Josephus uses Udeos, and Mason should know it's a direct transliteration of the Hebrew Yudeh, or the English Judah. Never once outside of bad English transliteration or translation is Jew in the Bible or Josephus. And if Mason looked closely in the Old Testament, he'd see a judgment such as described by Josephus, whether accurate or not, is entirely in accord with the agreement between Yahweh, God or Jehovah, and Israel at Mount Horeb, and is repeated throughout the law and prophets. Here is one poignant example. Quote, Yahweh will bring a nation against you from far, from the end of the earth, as the eagle flies, a nation whose language you will not understand, a nation of fierce facial expressions that doesn't respect the elderly nor show favor to the young. And they will eat the fruit of your livestock and the fruit of your ground until you are destroyed. They also won't leave you grain, new wine or oil, the increase of your livestock or the young of your flock, until they have caused you to perish. They will besiege you in all your gates until your high and fortified walls come down, in which you trusted throughout all your land. They will besiege you in all your gates throughout all your land, which Yahweh, your Allah, has given you. You will eat the fruit of your own body, the flesh of your sons and of your daughters, whom Yahweh, your Allah, has given you, in the siege and in the distress with which your enemies will distress you. Closed quote. Deuteronomy 28:49 through 53. In light of this passage, I think we can clearly see Mason's anti-Christian bias in painting the Christian as an unreasoning brute by suggesting that their confirmation of any judgment upon the Jew is unjustifiable. And that would be if this passage were even meant for the Jew, which it is not. It's meant for Israel, including Judah, i.e. modern Gaul or Celts, Anglo-Yeoman, Goth/Germanics, and many of the common class of people throughout European countries comprising the bulk of Christianity. But no matter if we insert the Jew or Israel Judah into this context, it is quite obvious to anyone who simply reads Scripture that the kind of judgment described within Josephus is not only warned of, but was agreed to and therefore expected and merited. The one point upon which I find myself in agreement with Mason is found on page 16. Quote, if the destruction of Jerusalem was punishment for the Jews' mistreatment of Jesus, why did it not occur until 40 years after the crucifixion? Closed quote. This would be about 6 weeks, as in a 7-year period, or week, thus 42 years, too many, according to the prophet Daniel. The timeline seems pretty sure. Quote, 70 weeks are decreed upon your people and your holy city, closed quote, from Daniel 9:24. Daniel 9:24 through 27 occurs all within those 70 prophetic weeks. Again, 1 week equals 7 years, thus 70 weeks equals 490 years in total. If Jesus came at the end of the 70, then we have a problem if we are looking at another 40 plus years for Judah. That's a full generation. In contrast, 40 years was the judgment on Israel in the wilderness per Numbers 14, 33, and 34, so that the eldest generation would be wiped out. Thus, many of those participating in the trial of Jesus would surely be dead. It's an excellent observation and a matter deserving more than passing thoughts, though unfortunately not a matter for this context. On page 20, Mason relays an oft-repeated theme. He interprets Josephus thusly, quote, he wrote, as we shall see, in order to explain Judaism to outsiders and to demonstrate its virtues in a world that was often hostile, closed quote. This purportive motive Mason is absolutely intent on supporting does not sit well with me. Why the need to explain Judaism if the scriptures were translated into at least Greek by then? Anyone could read them and understand, even if certain aspects were lost in translation. Perhaps we are looking at an apology meant to shield a people who were and would become even more hostile towards the audience Josephus was aimed at, that being Christians. Why the additional need to defend the Jews outside of providing the scriptures for anyone to read? This alleged hostility towards Jews that Mason goes on about seems to only historically bloom after prolonged interaction with them. Was there something about their past interactions with non-Jews or their anticipated future interactions that the author of Josephus knew would need a defense, thus the necessity of skewing the Old Testament's message? Mason's reasoning will not do. All signs in Josephus point to a carefully crafted shift, a shift in the substance of the Old Testament, a shift in ethnology, a shift in geography. These points, and more like them, will be addressed in due course, and in so doing, we will come to a far better understanding of the real aims of Josephian apologetics. Mason's statement on page 27 is abundantly insightful. He writes, quote, the intensive historical study of Josephus as of the New Testament and early Judaism took flight in the middle of the 19th century. These branches of study were based in Germany, where there was a remarkable awakening of scholarly interest in the ancient world. Professors began to produce massive reference works in their efforts to recover as much information as possible about ancient life and language. Numerous manuals, encyclopedias, lexicons, atlases, and dictionaries appeared, and serious archaeological work was begun in the Mediterranean countries. Although scholars of preceding centuries had already tried to reconstruct the original Greek texts of the New Testament and Josephus by comparing the many manuscripts that had survived, scholars of the 19th century pursued more disciplined projects along these lines, in the case of the New Testament with the aid of newly discovered manuscripts. Closed quote. The proliferation of these newer manuscripts and materials of the 19th century cannot be overstated. Neither should their benefits to the literary status quo we endure to this day. How does this apply to us? The 19th century was the time of the prolific German Celt orphan train programs in both Europe and America. It was the time of the great Prussian educational reforms, or more correctly, the Prussian re-education and de-education system, which spread all over the world. It was a time in which more wars have been recorded than perhaps any other. Children, for nearly a full century, were being removed from their parents and thus their culture and language, being de-educated and re-educated. Their parents now lost in wars, asylums, and hardships. This would have been the perfect time to introduce documents that would radically change the understanding of the Bible and all things Bible-related. History, or any other subject, needs no catastrophes to undergo serious change in our collective consciousness. It only needs a clean slate, a tabula rasa, and this in the form of children to reprogram. Is it a mere coincidence that all these programs, along with the prevailing ideas of children as clean slates, as well as widespread experiments on the minds and souls of so many accused of insanity, were all taking place simultaneously, in the same places, in the same ways, on the same peoples, with the same materials and curriculum? When the slate is clean in the form of little children, it may then be filled in the form of information profitable to the programmers. Books produced or printed before the 19th century are sparse. Records become increasingly difficult to confirm prior to the 19th century. Josephus saw its great popularization in the 19th century, in the heart of the re-education zone, predominantly within the target people of the re-education programs, the trains, the asylums, and the wars. It's no small thing that Mason states on page 29, quote, 1880 to 1920, when much of the fundamental work on Josephus was accomplished, closed quote. As these were the years the Prussian re-education program was spread to many areas of Western Europe and America, as were the overwhelmingly Celtic and Germanic representations of orphans being shipped abroad, being separated from their family, language, and history, i.e., reality. These were also the years of the great discoveries of papyrus and parchment, most of which proceeding from dubious sources, claims, and stories. Briefly, though not insignificant, a note on numerological significance. Mason writes on page 29, quote, Josephus gives only a few paragraphs to the years 6 to 66 in Judea, closed quote. These years being the most important to Christianity. I do not claim to know the significance to all the numerology employed by those using occulted language, but it is clear the number 6 and multiples thereof have great significance to those working within the realm of sub rosa. I will cease this line of inquiry only after a brief exposition. The Bible and nature seem to function at a base 12 level, not base 10. Therefore, nature and the Bible seem more harmonious with the imperial system, wherein 2s, 3s, 4s, and 6s all divide with ease into a standard of 12, as opposed to 10 and the accompanying decimals for the same number of divisions. In nature, we see this in 12 months being a year, 12 signs in the zodiac, 24 hours in a day being 2 sets of 12, 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds per minute, hexagonal patterns abounding in nature, and the measuring system of greatest variation and ease is imperial. We, using imperial, have inches, feet, yards, pounds and ounces, gallons, quarts, and pints. All are based on or harmonious with base 12. In the Bible, we see 6 work days, 6 creative days, 12 tribes of Israel, the year being split into 2 6-month sections, 6 required feasts at 3 required times, 6 years for a bondman to work, 6 branches in the lampstand, etc. Worth noting, this system would have been known in at least more educated circles, and the 3s, 6s, 9s, 12s, etc. may be functioning as a sort of general, though hidden, signal linguistic system worthy of further attention. This shift away from base 12 and natural fractions was accomplished at nearly the same time and place as the previous mentioned shifts in knowledge. I do not think it absurd to suggest the prolific use of all these base 12 numbers and combinations thereof may be a way of authenticating works or portions of works in the eyes of the adept, or more specifically, not for the eyes of the profane, which now function within base 10. On page 29, Mason also notes the, quote, widespread plagiarism in ancient literature, closed quote. I'm not sure that 2 or 10 people writing the truth about factual events can even be counted as plagiarism. Perhaps this phenomenon is due more to the possibility of a common author writing multiple texts under multiple names. And if it's simply an act of lifting whole sections of text and replacing it into another work, I do not see it as any less dubious than the first possibility. I will, however, concede that 2 may write the exact same events, but in different ways, with different descriptive wordings or perspectives. If Mason in fact means the word-for-word copying, however, I suggest this decreases the amount of independent witnesses to a given event and serves to weaken the bulwark of establishment-approved narratives. So, I must admit I don't exactly know what Mason defines or wishes us to believe regarding plagiarism among the ancients. Mason then turns back to one of his chief underlying themes by reiterating on page 31, quote, of being grateful that Josephus's works survived, while at the same time regretting the primary reason for their survival, as a rod with which to beat the Jews, closed quote. However, the mere fact that Josephus has survived, proliferated, and been aimed more at Christians than Jews, along with the intents and effects examined herein, tends to speak loudly against this notion. The last point in this first chapter, again on page 31, is this, quote, we can no longer use as proof things that would convince only our own constituencies, but must discuss history in a public way, with proof that is universally compelling, closed quote. On the same page, Mason begins his book-long defense of Josephus in light of every sign that we really should disregard him as any sort of reliable source. One must wonder if this style of information dissemination is what inspired Orwell to coin the term doublespeak. Highlights of Chapter 2, The Career of Josephus. On page 38, Mason recounts the claim of genealogy found in Josephus's life, prefacing it with, quote, although he claims to transmit only what he finds in the public record, this ancestry does not inspire confidence, closed quote. And why would it? I would expect an appropriate accounting fully back to Aaron, or at least to something outside of the apocryphal books. It's not as though Josephus was ever trying to save time or page space with all his grossly detailed oddities and side stories. A full accounting back to Aaron would be most responsible. But all we get is an apocryphal genealogy at best. And, interestingly enough, back to John Hyrcanus as both an ancestor and a hero to Josephus. You see, a real problem is that Josephus is the source for a concept that, were it absent, would weaken a number of historical religious positions as well as deflating a fundamental belief held by Christian identity in particular. That concept being the claim that John Hyrcanus is the one who integrated Edomites into Judah, thus becoming today's Jews, from Antiquity 13:9-1. This specifically Josephine claim and account allows them to identify the Oudeos of the Septuagint as Judah, but the Oudeos of the Gospels as Edomites. This is most convenient in light of the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44 in particular. Jesus, speaking to the Oudeos, who are now allowed to be Edomites, not Judahites, thanks only to Josephus, says, quote, "You are of your father, the devil, and you want to do the desires of your father. He was a murderer from the beginning and doesn't stand in the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks on his own, for he is a liar and the father of lies." Closed quote. This verse and so many others don't even cover the controversy present in the fact that it was the Oudeos who saw to it that Jesus was executed. Christian identity collapses inward without the ability to distinguish between the Judah of the Old Testament and the Judah of the New Testament. Therefore, they must live with the paradox of the immoral and unlawful act by Hyrcanus contrasted with the relationship and lauding of Josephus to this same Hyrcanus. They must choose, even if subconsciously, to trust the account of one so untrustworthy as Josephus in order to keep their dogma intact. This is not to single out and completely deride Christian identity, as at least they, unlike their evangelical counterparts, take notice of the disparity between the Old and New Testament Oudeos. Back to Mason. He proceeds for a couple more pages, citing Josephus's claims of pedigree and learning, claims that are often incredulous, such as, quote, "He claims that the leading dignitaries of the city used to seek out his advice when he was but 14 years of age," closed quote, from page 39. If he were only 2 years younger, it would sound a lot like another, more popular account, which we will get to. From there, beginning on page 41, Mason reveals some of the materials on Josephus's less than honorable, highly dubious, and ever contradictory military career. Any of the points in question regarding Josephus, contradictions, acts of admitted cowardice and ambition, and great treacheries are too many to begin to retell herein. Indeed, as the subsequent 5 pages demonstrate, the only reliability present in Life and War is that none of the data can be counted as reliable. This, however, doesn't stop Mason from finding good in Josephus, as he writes on page 46, quote, "Josephus's frankness about his many deceptions is probably best explained as a literary device intended to prove his heroic craftiness. We may assume with some confidence that he would not deliberately retell stories to his own injury," closed quote. We may also just as readily assume these works to be written by one or more authors who were not this Josephus, and therefore had no shame in making him out to be the coward, traitor, and liar we witness therein. How many authors, while providing no redemption to all their duplicitous actions, readily admit their scheming, bloodletting, and treachery in a book of history, and then hope it's interpreted someday as a literary device? This, too, requires much effort to believe. Pages 46 through 53 concern the alleged prophecy of Josephus to Vespasian, as well as the purported prophet's subsequent captivity and literary career. I am unable to comprehend what there may be, either within or without the works of Josephus, that could ever convince the shrewd reader of Vespasian's desire to believe a word out of Josephus's mouth, much less a word of prophecy claiming to be from the God of truth himself. Highlights of Chapter 3, The Writings of Josephus. This chapter contains a large amount of claims. Therefore, I will only be able to highlight a few that serve to better illustrate the problems found in Mason's and Josephus's works. I will attempt to best demonstrate the problems inherent in Josephus's and Mason's presentation of the material, but given how much must be addressed in this review, I will only be able to cite certain generalities as listed and commented upon by Mason. Though Mason addresses the actual letter of Josephus's writings, I will also point out the strong underlying themes that permeate throughout that often go unaccounted for. Mason breaks this demanding chapter into Roman perceptions of the Jews, Jewish war, Jewish antiquities, life, and against Appian. Concerning the four known works claimed as penned by Josephus, Mason writes on page 55, quote, "He was not only familiar with his native Hebrew and Aramaic traditions, but he also had achieved some basic facility in Greek language, literature, and thought even before he left Judea." Closed quote. At best, Greek would have been Josephus's third language, and it's reasonable to believe not a strong one. His patrons, remember, were Roman. The Romans' language was Latin. It is extremely difficult to juxtapose the brutal discipline of Rome against the idea that they may have readily allowed Greek as their lingua franca. And although many modern academics make arguments that the aristocracy of Rome preferred Greek, the tongue of a beaten and therefore inferior foe doesn't strike me as a thing that might become mainstream enough to commission historical accounts within it. An account financed by a Roman, in my view, seems most sensible to be penned in Latin. However, on page 65, Mason cites those who argue very confidently that Josephus was written originally in Greek. Quote, "Our Greek war is not merely a translation of the Semitic account that was sent to the East. On the contrary, the Greek version is written in an original, highly literary style, not translation Greek. It is filled with themes and vocabulary, e.g., for fate, free will, fortune, providence, and historical accuracy that were native to the Greek and Hellenistic literature." Closed quote. The inability to examine the original sources only helps to add to our confusion when we read from the pen of Josephus himself in War, Preface 1, quote, "I have proposed to myself, for the sake of such as live under the government of the Romans, to translate those books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our own country, and sent to the upper barbarians." Closed quote. Now we see a linguistic mystery. Common sense says all Roman works from Josephus ought to be in Latin. The style appears to dictate an innate Greek language and cultural mind, while the author's text plainly says it was translated from Hebrew. Unlike Mason's continually patronizing shoulder shrugs over history's mysteries, I will assert that this type of conflict is exactly what the creators and perpetrators of Josephus were and are after from the outset. Clarity is a thing to be avoided at all costs. Mason abounds with insights throughout this chapter and the whole of the book, reminding us of how little the Romans knew or understood of Judaism. I must obsessively repeat that Judaism, by its very nature, neither is nor was the substance of the Old Testament, but of the Talmud, which wasn't even said to be fully codified and penned by this time. Make no mistake, Judaism is not the practice of following the law and the prophets, but the practice of following rabbinical writing said to be based on the law and the prophets. The Old Testament has little, if anything, to do with religion. The practice of the Talmud and Kabbalah, or Judaism, is filled with religion, philosophy, and politics. If it were indeed the law and prophets, or Old Testament, that Josephus sought to clarify, he did his patrons a terrible disservice. If his intent were to instead transform the law and prophets into Judaism for later unsuspecting readers, then he did very well. Mason throughout supports the notion that Judaism is the equivalent of the law and prophets. On page 59, Mason writes, quote, "Because religion was so closely woven into the fabric of life, observant Jews living in the Greco-Roman world could not participate fully in normal civic affairs." Closed quote. The idea both presented by Josephus and echoed over and over by Mason that the Jews were so separatist flies in the face of everything we would come to know of the Israel-Judah of the Bible. And whether one wishes to call them Jew or Judah, both Josephus's and Mason's portrayals of them as pining away for the purity of practice of the law and prophets is in stark contrast to the behaviors of true Israel-Judah found within Scripture. Quote, "But you have played the prostitute with many lovers, yet return again to me, says Yahweh." Closed quote. Jeremiah 3:1. Quote, "I saw when, for this very cause, that backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Yet treacherous Judah, her sister, had no fear, but she also went and played the prostitute." Closed quote. Jeremiah 3:8. Quote, "When Yahweh spake at first by Hosea, Yahweh said to Hosea, Go, take for yourself a wife of prostitution and children of unfaithfulness, for the land commits great adultery, forsaking Yahweh." Closed quote. Hosea 1:2. Quote, "Their names were Aholah the elder and Aholibah her sister. They became mine, and they bore sons and daughters. As for their names, Samaria was Aholah, and Jerusalem Aholibah. Aholah played the prostitute when she was mine. She doted on her lovers, on the Assyrians, her neighbors." Closed quote. Ezekiel 23:4 and 5. And, quote, "Her sister Aholibah saw this, yet she was more corrupt in her lusting than she, and in her prostitution, which was more depraved than the prostitution of her sister. She lusted after the Assyrians, governors and rulers, her neighbors, clothed more gorgeously, horsemen riding on horses, all of them desirable young men." Closed quote. From Ezekiel 23:11 and 12. In addition, lest anyone believes this behavior was just for a time, Nehemiah and Ezra recorded the very same behaviors after the Babylonian captivity. Israel-Judah acted in this manner from the time of the wilderness with Moses straight through until when? Maccabees? Josephus? Suddenly the Judahites, now called Jews, are pious separatists? Highly unlikely. Yahweh, being the name that many have been taught as Yahweh or even Jehovah, but without the addition of the influence of the Masorah in the form of vowel points, knew there was only one way to deal with Israel and Judah, and that was to fundamentally change them as a people. This would involve banishing them to foreign lands, subjecting them to slavery and hardships, and so on. And all of this would happen post-Babylon. According to Scripture, they would not change before all this befell them. And if they were now, and also during the Greek occupation, pious, why had Judah been under foreign occupation for those 4 centuries? It is clearly stated in the covenant with Israel that obedience was rewarded with freedom and prosperity. We have a fundamental problem if we believe that the lawfully zealous Jew was under both Grecian and Roman occupation. Quote, "It shall happen if you shall listen diligently to Yahweh your Allah's voice, to observe to do all his commandments which I command you today, that Yahweh your Allah will set you high above all the nations of the earth." Closed quote, Deuteronomy 28:1. Since Josephus's and Mason's Jews were separatists, the only realistic way to see them as such is exactly as today's Jews are separatists, i.e. as Talmudists and Kabbalists, thus pagans, and anything but keepers of the laws and covenants of the Old Testament. This again presents a serious problem for the reliability of both Josephus and Mason, as either should know the differences between biblical Judah and the Talmudic Jew, as well as the specifications of the aforementioned covenant. What is of additional interest is the fact that today's Jews are indistinguishable from the deuterocanonical Jews and all apocryphal Jews, as well as the Jews of the highly dubious Book of Esther. When these sources are compared against the other 38 books of the Law and Prophets, and the sharp contrasts between them are so clearly illustrated, one should conclude that we are seeing two distinctly different people. The only way to reconcile the two is to redefine the Old Testament or insert claims such as the aforementioned Hyrcanus Idumean account and later claims of Edomite subversion. This, I contend, is where and why Josephus comes in. On a positive note, if anyone is looking for the highlights of the 4 books of Josephus, Mason does a very good job of saving the reader from the cruelty of self-inflicted Josephus study. I would, however, recommend checking all the writings attributed to Josephus for oneself. There is a world of aggravating factors to be perused in Josephus. Searchable PDFs in both English and Greek are currently in circulation and readily available at no cost. Highlights of Chapter 4, Who's Who in the New Testament World. The first sentence of this chapter is so classic, so unashamedly truthful, and just so brazenly arrogant, it must be restated herein. Mason begins, quote, "The 3 preceding chapters have dealt with Josephus on his own terms," closed quote. And perhaps more than anything I've seen hitherto, I do indeed agree. This 66-page chapter focuses mainly on Herod and family, Roman governors of Judea, the Jewish high priesthood, and the Jewish philosophical schools, namely the Pharisees and Sadducees. Although I'm certain it would be fascinating to point out all the curious things Josephus wrote about these characters, I would like to instead present items of great interest, both within and without Mason's book, that may cast far more light on this Josephus, and perhaps Mason as well. Herod the Great and family. Before getting to Mason and Josephus, I'd like to point out one thing that, to my knowledge, has gone unnoticed, and that is how the name Herod is used over and over again by this dynasty. Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, Herodias, Herod II, Herod of Chalcis. This is not simply used as a family name or first, second, third, etc., but used in the odd way in which one descendant of Herod the Great may bear the name Herod, while the other is Philip, or Aristobulus, or Archelaus. Was this a surname? If so, what was the first name of Herod, brother of Philip? Was it Herod? Why isn't Philip Herod or Herod Philip? This doesn't have the consistency of a George Foreman situation in which one names all their children after themselves. Furthermore, if Herod were a title or family name, why is the wife of Philip Herodias? Strong's G2266, as in female Herod. Also, we see in Matthew 22:16 and Mark 3:6 and 12:13 people called Herodians. Strong's G2265, as in a group, not particularly a family. What is the significance? Mason writes on page 153, quote, "Remarkably, the gospel writers refer to this dynasty in the vaguest of terms," closed quote. Perhaps this is because those same gospel writers understood Herod to be a title or tribal name, not a family name. This would be similar to using the term dictator. Perhaps Josephus was needed to also make the Herods seem as a familial dynasty, which could then more readily be harmonized with the idea of Rome as the fourth kingdom of Daniel 2 and 7 being in power at this time. Mason mentions on page 152 that tetrarch, a title ascribed to multiple characters, means ruler of a fourth. As I point out in the PDF and video entitled Bringing It All Together, page 35, the kingdom that would be in power in Judea at this time would not be Rome as we currently understand ancient Rome, but would have been Yun. Strong's H3120 and 21, transliterated sometimes as Javan or translated as Greece. Why, other than the obvious reasons, is this information very important? Because as Daniel 8 and Zechariah 1 state, Yun, and more specifically the four sub-kingdoms Yun became, thus the four-horn imagery, and not the last kingdom we believe to be this Rome, would be the kingdom to scatter Judah and Jerusalem. Quote, "The rough male goat is the king of Greece," or Yun. "The great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. As for that which was broken, in the place where four stood up, four kingdoms will stand up out of the nation, but not with his power," closed quote, from Daniel 8:21 and 22. And, quote, "I lifted up my eyes and saw, and behold, four horns. I asked the angel who talked with me, 'What are these?' He answered me, 'These are the horns which have scattered Judah, Israel, and Jerusalem,'" closed quote, from Zechariah 1:18 and 19. No other nation than Yun produces these four horns. Upon consulting many sources, no one seems to agree on exactly which names were the sub-tribes comprising the Mughal or later Mongol Empire, but all seem to agree it was either 5 or 4. So, considering this, let us now add the Hebrew, or again more properly, OBRY term, red. Strong's H7287 and H7300, along with the OBRY E being the prefix denoting definite article, i.e. the, and being originally pronounced erid. If we should take erid and transliterate it into Koine Greek, we should see an H aspirant at the beginning and a forced random vowel between R and D, which is a common method in Koine transliteration. We arrive at Herod. And most important to this exercise, the OBRY term erid is translated rule, reign, or have dominion. It's interesting that one of the most obscured, though remarkably powerful groups of lost, mysterious history and operating in the right geography at the right time were called the Radonites. In OBRY, this would be Erudanim, being comprised of the erid we just saw, plus the un suffix typically denoting a procession from, and capped by the plural Im. And whether these obscured international merchants in human cargo, the Radonites, were a progression from the Herods or not, it is remarkable how both the OBRY Herod means rule, while the Koine Greek Herod has no consistency of nomenclatural usage, and yet were the rulers of the day. And if that weren't odd enough, Mason tells us that the greatest source available on the Herods is none other than Josephus. And this greatest source just so happens to change his opinions, stories, and details about the Herods from antiquities to war. However, still determined to excite us, if even with unintentional levity, Mason writes on page 161, quote, "One cannot easily challenge Josephus's account of the Herodian family tree because it is a tightly woven and intricate whole based on excellent sources," closed quote. Though surprisingly, Mason doesn't cite these excellent sources. I suppose as a consolation, Mason does provide us with a very convincing-looking chart on the next page, perhaps in lieu of these excellent, though sadly absent, sources. The Roman governors of Judea. On pages 164 and 165, Mason gives us some common sense reasoning behind the actions of the Roman governors of Judea. No, I'm sorry, I meant Judea. You see, it gets so confusing when I have to refer to the people of Judah as Jew and the land of Judah as the all too very obvious Judea. Continuing, Mason writes, quote, "But the Romans were disinclined to invest their own administrative and military resources into a rule of a faraway territory unless it were absolutely necessary," closed quote. Then, quote, "It was time to make Judea an imperial province, bringing it under the direct control of Roman governors and armies," closed quote. Keeping these quotes in mind, and before I discuss the alleged rulers themselves, I do have an important question. Why? Why Palestine? Palestine, the supposed location of the inherited lands of Israel, Judah, is not now, nor is there reason to believe it ever was a good investment for anyone. The U.S. taxpayer, German Holocaust reparations payer, Zionist Christians, and whites in general have sunk billions into that dry desert swamp, hot, uneven country the size of New Jersey to make it livable for predominantly the claimed 6 million Jews therein, while the reported 6 million Palestinians to this day live in squalor. The Jews there enjoy a life approximately as good as in most southwestern U.S. desert states, and that's comparable only if those U.S. states had a strong and brutal apartheid in effect, as this small hot tourist trap indeed does. And that Jewish-centered quality of lifestyle is only possible after decades of the best minds in the Western world engineering the landscape, irrigating the desert, filtering the Sea of Galilee and Mediterranean, and piping it to Jerusalem and other locations, building modern homes and facilities, and feeding the population. At best, it currently serves as an international center for criminal refuge, money laundering, theft, Mideast instability, American and Western distraction from the issues at home, evangelical donation schemes, etc. Why would an empire such as Rome see any value in it? Why would they see any value in a place and a people said to be nothing but trouble? It is commonly claimed the value of Palestine was because of its location. Anyone who wanted to go north to south or vice versa needed to travel along the coast, as just a few miles inland becomes very difficult to traverse, and Palestine occupied a great deal of the East Mediterranean coastline. Interestingly, The inflated claims of the importance of the Silk Road/spice route, i.e. the ancient caravan road, are continually compared with today's illogical Belt and Road Initiative. But this route is known to have gone along the Arabian coast and Yemen to Egypt, bypassing the land of Palestine. And really, what purpose would Palestine have served to merchants going from one great land of spices and silks, i.e. India and East Asia, to another great land of different textiles, that being Egypt? And it is only recently that the citrus and dairy industries have been created to give Israel the appearance of value. Outside of traveling directly to Palestine, and for what? The access to the coastline, with no good natural ports, mind you, would have been pointless then, when an army or merchant could have sailed to most other places more worthy of their time and expense. Take away Palestine's, or more specifically the state of Israel's, current value to the rulers of today, that being an international criminal refuge and a distraction from the real battlefield located in Western countries and specifically America. Go back centuries, and one can see that there was nothing about Palestine of renown or interest. When Mark Twain visited in the 1800s, the greatest boast therein was the tourism, and even that required that the most devout of men be impervious to heat sickness, food poisoning, starving beggars everywhere, animal cruelty, and continual dehydration. In all reality, the innocent and devout Christian traveler, as even Twain noted, must suppress the inner loss of beholding such a barren and often heartbreaking disappointment that was and yet is Palestine. What, pray tell, could have possibly been Rome's perceived value in Palestine to cause them to invest therein? Taxing Bedouins? The acquisition of a few goats and salty gore farming? I cannot overstate how unproductive a place this is, even in relation to Italy alone or among all Mediterranean countries, or how indecent it has been to rob what Palestinians are there of the resources they had been using for time immemorial in order to create this crooked money pit. The fact that Mason and most others treat the idea of Roman interest in Palestine as reasonable is in direct contradiction to the way it has remained for the past few centuries until the early 20th century. A place where no one, other than starry-eyed Christians and outcasts, wished to go or live. Back to the governors. Mason mentions on page 165 that only 3 Roman governors are cited in the New Testament: Pontius Pilate, Antonius Felix, and Porcius Festus. 2 of these 3, Antonius Felix and Porcius Festus, are in Acts alone. Only Pilate appears in the Gospels. Worthy of note is the fact that these Roman governors are referred to in Greek as hegemon, Strong's G 2232, which is also translated as ruler or prince. Now, what's important is that no ruler or prince in the Old Testament, including in eschatological prophecies, are the status of a king, since its close cognate hegeomai, Strong's G 2232, is similarly translated, among other things, rule, esteem, or judge. I see no consistent reason, as the New Testament is supposed to be a continuation of the Old Testament, to count Pilate as higher in authority than the tetrarchs called Basileus, which actually is a king. These Basileus are the Herods. Now, it is true that the Gospels cite Jesus being accused of criminal behavior, including blasphemy and potential insurrection, with only the latter being of importance to the ruling authority, and that only if he were actually found guilty. Even so, without any previous record or a great incident caused by him, Are we to believe he would be brought immediately before the highest governor of all the land? The unheard-of lightning-fast trial and execution recorded in all the Gospels aside, we must recognize that there is a good reason the courts of most governments function the way that they do. That is to prioritize criminal cases. Typically, an accused criminal will be seen by a lower magistrate first, then sent up the chain. But Jesus is found immediately before Pilate. The so-called Jewish Sanhedrin was not a part of the regime's bureaucracy, so Pilate would have been the first official to see the accused. And at Jesus' first appearance, he managed to get before the highest bureaucrat in all the land. And then there's the strange act of Pilate sending him, shall we say, up to Herod in Luke. It is also curious how Pilate's name, or perhaps title, closely resembles pontiff, as in pagan high priest or religious authority, as pontiff does appear to have had other uses prior to its current standard. Etymologically, both Pontio, Strong's G 4194, and Pilato, Strong's G 4091, are strikingly similar to pontiff in the first case and Polit or politics, as in bishop of the politic or pontifex of the politburo in the second case. And given that much of Old Greek and Hebrew did not use the qualifiers of today, specifically of, Pontius Pilate can be reasonably seen as equating Pontio being the position plus the translational addition of plus Pilato being the entity, thing, or office. Additionally, when we check the official roots for pontiff, we find it often having to do with bridging. He may well have been the emissary of the politic, and not even the most powerful man in Judea, but the magistrate with the power in that jurisdiction to order an execution. If we stay to biblical facts alone, Pilate appears to quite possibly be a very different person than his Josephan counterpart. The other two Roman governors mentioned, appearing biblically only in Acts, may not even be holders of the same position and office as this Pilate. It is always the case that in order for the target audience to see these persons and scenarios in an establishment-approved light, a Josephus, a Eusebius, or a Jerome are necessary. In all, one thing is for certain. One simply cannot place either the Herods or Pilate in the positions asserted by Josephus and other echo chamber texts if one were to use the Gospels or even Acts alone. Indeed, Pilate appears to simply be a bureaucrat over a particular jurisdiction. This, too, is not even to mention the oddities associated with Pilate's act of sending Jesus to Herod and Herod sending him back to Pilate, as we see in Luke, and the problems of jurisdiction and jurisprudence this presents. Without Josephus and years of establishment reinforcement, I would have thought Herod was more powerful than Pilate. But again, this is why we have both Josephus and Mason to clarify. The Jewish high priests. In this section, I will specifically be using the proper term Judahite, even as the writings called Josephus do the same in their proper use of Judah, in contrast to Mason, Whiston, and every other Josephine translator I'm aware of insisting on Jew. The first striking feature of this section on page 180, which was brought up earlier by Mason, is Josephus's claimed lineage on both sides to the Hasmoneans, who have their source in the apocryphal books of Maccabees 1 through 4. One serious issue I have with this idea is that based on the lineage of these men, according to 1 Maccabees 2, they would have been Levites, yet they held a kingship over Judah for many long years. The Levites of the Law and Prophets neither held such a position nor were they ever expected to. Yahweh never appointed any Levite to a kingship, and while Moses, a Levite, served as the leader of Israel for 40 years, the initial plan was to simply deliver them from Mitzrayim to Canaan, a few months to a year at best, and then the judges were instituted. And even the judges only had Moses and Eli to boast from the tribe of Levi, and again, not as kings. The idea that anyone outside the tribe of Judah holding the position of king, most specifically over the kingdom of Judah, would appear to radically contradict this prophecy from Jacob. Quote, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. To him will the obedience of the peoples be." Closed quote from Genesis 49:10. Yahweh chose to establish David and his seed from the tribe of Judah as the line of kings of Israel, his descendants remaining in Judah after the parting of the two kingdoms. Any other kings that Yahweh put on the throne of Israel, or who put themselves upon the throne, did not last, but David's did. David was promised such a kingship in perpetuity, thus the great need of a genealogy in Matthew 1 and Luke 3, the purpose being to provide a necessary lineage of Jesus from Adam, Abraham, and absolutely most specifically from David and the Judahite kings. Yahweh even promises that David's seed through Solomon would be established as the line of kings of Israel forever. Quote, "He will build me a house, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. I will not take my loving kindness away from him, as I took it from him that was before you. But I will settle him in my house and in my kingdom forever. His throne will be established forever." Closed quote from 1 Chronicles 17:12 through 14. So, the theme of David's throne being occupied by David's seed is throughout the prophets and spelled out in the book of Chronicles. Yet, we are expected to believe these Maccabean Levites would take the rule of Judah and not instead seek to find David's seed and appoint him king? After all, Zerubbabel, David's descendant, came back with Judah from Babylon, and he was still bearing rule at the time. Furthermore, we have no prophet to anoint these Levites as kings, no prophecy concerning them, and no direct segue from any later prophets to the books of Maccabees. We have only Josephus. These Levites are now sounding eerily similar to the pontiffs of politics. Again, these priests, Herods, governors, or scribes, Pharisees, and Sadducees' details would be more subject to strictly biblical interpretation, if not for the books of Maccabees and Josephus, and that must be ever kept in mind as a crucial factor. Mason attempts to justify these unprecedented new Josephan rules far removed from the law and prophets by writing on page 181, quote, "But after the Babylonian exile, 586 through 538 BCE, there were no longer kings or regular prophets in Israel, so the high priest inevitably assumed such political functions as the Jews retained under foreign domination," closed quote. Here, Mason, as with many examples that could be cited from this book, misrepresents the biblical facts in favor of a more apocryphal Josephan narrative. But there was indeed still a king of the seed of David leading Judah after the exile to Babylon and return to Jerusalem. As just mentioned, his name was Zerubbabel. This from Ezra. Quote, "Now these are the children of the province who went up out of the captivity of those who had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away to Babylon, and who returned to Jerusalem and Judah, every one to his city, who came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Realiah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigphi, Rehum, and Baanah, the number of the men of the people of Israel. Closed quote from Ezra 2, 1 and 2. Note that Jeshua the priest came with Zerubbabel, not the other way around. And again, quote, they, being the Samaritans, came near to Zerubbabel and to the heads of the fathers' households, and said to them, let us build with you, for we seek your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here. Closed quote from Ezra 4:2. He may not have been called king, but he was still the acting king of David's seed. And again, quote, who are you, great mountain? Before Zerubbabel you are a plain, and he will bring out the capstone with shouts of grace, grace to it. Moreover, Yahweh's word came to me, saying, the hands of Zerubbabel have laid the foundation of this house. His hands also shall finish it, and you will know that Yahweh of armies has sent me to you. Closed quote from Zechariah 4, 7 through 9. Throughout Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah, we see Zerubbabel, the seed of David, occupying the place of king. We see Jeshua, the seed of Aaron, occupying the place of priest. We do not see the priesthood in the law and prophets assuming power. The only places we can find such things is in the Apocrypha, Maccabees in particular, and Josephus. We have no reason to perceive Josephus's accounts of the Hasmoneans and the Jewish priesthood kingship as anything other than pure fantasy, and whatever else it is or isn't, it most definitely is not in agreement with the law and prophets. And the trend of both Josephus and Mason misrepresenting biblical facts does not end there. An additional issue of Josephus-Mason biblical inaccuracy appears on page 187, where Mason writes, quote, Josephus's portrayals of the high priests throw considerable light on the New Testament, closed quote, and in the next paragraph, quote, but Josephus everywhere assumes that the high priest is the head of the Jewish council, closed quote. To back this claim, Mason cites 5 passages, 3 from Mark and 2 from Acts. The ones in Mark merely show this archiereia, Strong's G749, or high priest, as one of a few people/groups plotting together, not as the head of any council, and as popular as the term Synedrion, Strong's G4892, or Sanhedrin, appears to be with extra-biblical sources and thought. In a strictly biblical context, it means nothing more than a council or a meeting, not the council or the meeting, as in an official body that the high priest is in charge of. He may well have been the one in charge of the questioning of Paul in Acts 22:30 and 23:10, but that doesn't justify the idea of the great Sanhedrin of Josephus or any other extra-biblical literature. And soon enough, we spot another problem of consistency in Josephus's information on the high priest when compared to the Bible. Josephus claims a high priest retires, as though it were a career. From page 188, quote, Josephus allows former high priests to retain the title and prestige of the office as long as they live, closed quote. But this doesn't appear to be the case in the law and prophets. However, interestingly enough, it is the case in the world as we know it today. Judges, presidents, doctors, and clergy all retain this title after retirement. But retirement isn't a concept we can readily witness in the Old Testament. To begin this brief look at biblical priests, let's begin with what we see them as therein. Most of us have been trained to know them as Kohen from the Masoretic, but in OBRY they are Ken. Kohen means nothing outside of Masoretic Hebrew, but Ken, interestingly, is the Celtic word meaning range of vision or knowledge. In German, it is Sehen, the S phonetic often proceeding from the diaphonic C being used at a prior point. What makes this hold some fascination is that in the Old Testament, a Ken is not an office or thing entirely specific to only Israel. Quote, Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest, or Ken, of God Most High. Closed quote, Genesis 14:18. Quote, to Joseph were born 2 sons before the year of famine came, who, Asnath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest, or Ken, of On, bore to him. Closed quote, from Genesis 41:50. And, quote, now Moses was keeping the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest, or Ken, of Midian. Closed quote, from Exodus 3:1. And Aaron, the first Ken, or so-called priest of proper Israel, is never referred to as, in Masoretic Hebrew, HaKohen HaGadol, or high priest. It is true Aaron was the first Ken of Israel, and certainly the most esteemed, but never is he called high priest. It simply reads priest or priests, and for Israel, the Kenim, or priests, are those from Aaron's seed. This isn't a position that is retired from. In Numbers 20:22 through 29, Aaron's garments were transferred to his son Eleazar, and then Aaron died. Aaron's sons are born Kenim. The Kenim of Israel were only of the tribe of Levi, and though some may be well esteemed as eldest or revered, there may have been, at any given time, a handful of well-esteemed, older, honored Kenim or priests, depending on which of the 12 inheritances one is in, as there were to be Luim or Levites and Kenim among all the tribal territories of Israel. Furthermore, even regarding this term priest, as it has been forced upon us, quote, bring Aaron your brother and his sons with him near to you from among the children of Israel, that he may minister to me in the priest's office, even Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar, Aaron's sons. Closed quote, from Exodus 28:1. The term being used there, again in Masoretic Hebrew, is la kahana loi, and is translated as the following passage, quote, that he may minister unto me in the priest's office, closed quote. Now, this is clearly a verb, to ken unto me, not a noun, as in an office or a career. This, again, from the Law and Prophets, is a decidedly different picture than what we get from Josephus, Mason, and the whole of the establishment. The term high priest is used only 23 times in various ways in the entire canon of the Old Testament. It appears twice concerning the cities of refuge found throughout tribal inheritances in the context of, quote, a man may leave upon the death of the high priest, closed quote. Its context also repeatedly seems to dictate most esteemed. And there is no specific entry per Strong's for the two words comprising it, which we may expect were they meant to be taken together, such as we see in Strong's H884 with Beersheba or Strong's H382 with Ishtob. These being but two examples of many entries comprising individual words listed together due to their self-evident link. In fact, Gadul, Strong's H1419, and presented as high when it suits academics, is translated variously as great 397 times, high 22 times, greater 19 times, loud 9 times, greatest 9 times, elder 8 times, great man 8 times, mighty 7 times, eldest 6 times, and miscellaneous 44 times. And among the 44 miscellaneous entries, we find examples such as very, more, and sore. It certainly isn't singular in concept as seen here. Quote, David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest, as in Gadul, Strong's H1419, David's older brothers, followed Saul, closed quote, from 1 Samuel 17:14. Gadul, presented specifically as high by Josephus, truly and biblically, appears to be eldest, great, or preeminent, and this being the case, one cannot simply retire from being eldest, great, or preeminent. Kenim could have their career ended, such as the case of Nadab and Abihu from Leviticus 10, or Aaron their father as seen earlier, but the structure of one or more retired high priests holding the office of high priest while a current high priest also holds that office is not an Old Testament concept, and it may not even be a strictly New Testament observance, as it is often very difficult to pin down equivalent terms when relying on the translations alone to define these terms. Even if it appears that there may be more than one high priest living at once, such as in the case of Josedek, Eliashab, and Jeshua/Joshua from the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah, which is the only time there appears to be an overlap in the same place and time frame, these seemingly complex overlaps do not prove a high priest retires, as they are never shown in this context. And only once is Jeshua/Joshua referred to as high priest from Zechariah 3:1 in a vision. Every other time we see him referenced, it is as Jeshua/Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, from Haggai 1:1, for example, showing Josedek, not his son Jeshua/Joshua, as the high priest. These examples do not support Josephus's Roman Catholic Essene Oriental interpretation of priesthood. What we see instead is the seemingly random term esteemed priest, and that is certainly not singular in office, nor does it require one's retirement from such. Whatever the exact nature of the Kenim, or so-called priests, of Old Testament scripture, the following characterization by Josephus is abundantly flawed and misleading. On page 188, Mason informs us, quote, Josephus plainly regards the high priesthood and the temple service as the heart and soul of Judaism, closed quote. Similarly, the priest and service are the heart and soul of Catholicism, the Han priest and service, the heart and soul of Taoism, the Hindi priest and service, the heart and soul of Hinduism. The heart and soul of the Old Testament, by contrast, is the reality of the God of Jacob/Israel and his covenants with Israel, Judah, expressed in the law and prophets. Even though the singular book of Leviticus mainly concerns the practical duties of Levites and Kenim, or priests, they in their duties are not the heart and soul of the Old Testament. The heart and soul of the Old Testament is the God thereof, his creation, his ways, his laws, his covenants, and it does not take a priest or ceremony to engage him or he engage you, as seen, for one, in Moses' special relationship to Yahweh. Moses, you may recall, was the younger brother to Aaron, and not the Gadul, whether it be high, eldest, or esteemed, in comparison to Aaron, yet Yahweh's relationship to Moses was far closer than towards Aaron, the, again, so-called high priest. These discoveries, both mentioned by Mason and expounded on with a view to clarification by me herein, lead to a precarious matter in question in the New Testament. This situation, which Mason aptly demonstrates over the next few pages, is: who was the high priest at Jesus' trial? This is a very real issue. The problem being that in the New Testament we frequently see archiereus, Strong's G 749, translated chief priests, plural, as in multiples, and not only at Jesus' trial. The translators of the New Testament try to downplay this by translating it high priest when singular and chief priests when plural. We should have great reservation at this point because, as demonstrated from the Old Testament, this term isn't an office, but a status among a bloodline, as in the eldest, most esteemed among the Kenim, or the sons of Aaron. There cannot be high priests among the Kenim in the career then retirement sense, nor is it likely if there were a Ken Egedul, or high priest, in another geographical locale, that he and other high priests would be gathered together as frequently as we see these archiereus together in the New Testament. Either we do have an office being bought and sold, appointed and temporarily occupied, then retired from, as Josephus seems to support, which would not conform to the Old Testament Aaronic priesthood, or this term, high priest, according to Josephus, isn't referring to the Kenim, or priests of the sons of Aaron of the tribe of Levi at all, but something quite different, though being presented as the Aaronic Kenim. The fact is, there is no definite link between the hierarchia, Strong's G 2409, or priests, and the Lewites, Strong's G 3019, or Levites, whatsoever in the New Testament. This should give us pause, and even a will to consider future investigation of this oddity. It is fair to say I am well pleased with a number of points Mason addresses, though I wonder how many of these productive points are lost on anyone unaware of the fundamental problems of terminology and assumption Mason employs. Pharisees and Sadducees. A great deal of time could and should be spent on these two apparent sects from the New Testament, but herein we will only be able to look at a few points. On page 193, driving home the necessity of laborious analysis and clarification of everything about Josephus and his commentators, such as Mason himself, Mason writes, quote, "Once again, Josephus is our only contemporary source of information about these groups outside the New Testament," close quote, and this includes the Old Testament. No Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, Hellenists, etc. are even hinted at in the Law and Prophets, nor do any of our current lexicons and translations reveal them therein. This being the case, and given the importance of at least two of these groups in the New Testament, nothing about Josephus can be taken lightly. Everything must be critically examined. It is noteworthy that, as we'll see, Pliny the Elder and Philo, two establishment-approved historians, both write on the Essenes, but neither write on the Pharisees nor Sadducees, the two most powerful sects in Judea. This is inexplicable. Though the subtitle of this section is Pharisees and Sadducees, Mason must comment frequently on the Essenes, as they are so highly thought of and profusely included in Josephus. They aren't, however, anywhere to be found in the Bible. Mason writes, quote, "It is intriguing that no New Testament author mentions the Essenes, for Josephus always includes them with the Pharisees and the Sadducees," closed quote, and on page 207, quote, "If the Essenes were to be found in each town of Palestine from War 2.124, they must have been known to Jesus, closed quote. Yet not a word or indication of them is mentioned throughout the modern canon. The fact is indeed, as Mason frames it, intriguing. A few moments of contemplation concerning the Essenes will prove they are not only the ancient equivalents of the monastics, but they are likely the earliest example via Josephus, Pliny the Elder, and Philo of communists. They were the Schwabian paradigm, as they owned nothing and were happy. This communist ideal is also applied to the church by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles, but again is not a principle remotely discovered in the Law and Prophets. Additionally, the Dead Sea Scrolls, a compilation of highly questionable and remarkably influential documents, are credited to the Essenes. The Dead Sea Scrolls were said to be discovered by a Bedouin shepherd boy who led his goats to an area no one would think of as good pasture and threw rocks in a cave until he heard one of the clay pots holding these documents break. Then he kept the 2,000-year-old scrolls hanging on a tent pole and frequently handled them. Luckily, the only scrolls that may have been damaged by this treatment were, arguably, the most important: the Great Isaiah Scroll, the Habakkuk Commentary, and the Community Rule. Of course, the Great Isaiah Scroll alone, if for nothing else, offers a glimpse at an older, or at least different, Hebrew without the Masorah, and acts as the bait to reel in the curious towards all the rest of the highly suspect finds offered within the Dead Sea Scroll canon. This means whether this purported discovery was genuine or not, the Great Isaiah Scroll still holds valuable offerings. It's a shame that it was among the few documents treated as a flag by the shepherd boy. This discovery, incidentally, was made just prior to the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and represents one of the strongest fact-on-the-ground claims for both Josephus's Essenes and the establishment's Palestine as the biblical land of Canaan/Israel model. And is it out of the question to speculate that one of the motives for popularizing Josephus was to infect the minds of common people ruled over by Prussia, the Netherlands, and England, i.e. the yeomen of Western Europe, or mostly Israel, Judah, with the idea that a pious life was one of poverty, acceptance, and celibacy? All this considered, it's a remarkable contrast. Josephus's praise of the Catholic/Oriental monkish Essene versus his disdain for the hard-edged, law-keeping Sadducee. Ironically, it would be the propagation of the practice of law-keeping, which the Sadducee appeared to typify, that would give Israel-Judah the best chance, then and now, to escape out from under the boots of their enemies. Mason does go on to explore these Josephan favorites further. On page 194, Mason gives us the briefest of accurate definitions of the Sadducees. Quote, "The Pharisees affirm the activity of fate and the immortality of the soul. The Sadducees deny both positions, insisting on absolute freedom of will and rejecting afterlife with its rewards and punishments." Closed quote. Further on, he writes, quote, "The Pharisees have their own special tradition in addition to the scripture, whereas the Sadducees accept only the biblical laws." Closed quote. Based solely on these two passages, I cannot find reason to dislike the Sadducee. If this representation is true, the Sadducee was the one sect found in Josephus who harmonized with the law and prophets. One must wonder then why Josephus goes out of his way to libel the Sadducee in an ever-persistent way. Over the course of this section, the dominant themes are Josephus's praise of the Essenes, even comparing himself to them, and his criticism accompanied by potentially libelous statements against the Sadducees. If Josephus truly was a man who loved his country and countrymen, it is inconceivable as to why he would revile the lone group representing the greatest possibility of redemption from foreign occupation. And given the fact that Jesus himself said that he came to keep the law, I must once again insist that this Josephus and his motives are highly suspicious. To be fair, Josephus doesn't confine his criticism to the Sadducee alone, as the Pharisee gets a great deal of it as well, depending on which book of Josephus is being read, and whether or not Josephus is being honest with the reader at the time. By now, it is very difficult to determine Josephus's level of honesty. On page 204, Mason attempts to dispel the popularly held belief that Josephus was a Pharisee. He points out that Josephus had stated in Life that he studied with all the prevailing schools and found them unsatisfying. He then quotes Josephus, quote, "I begin to govern my life by the rules of the Pharisees," closed quote. Mason goes on to make a convincing argument, generally saying that Josephus simply meant, regarding the Pharisee, as they do, according to their ways, who dominate the culture. Josephus himself claims that most of his study time was with a monk named Banus, who was, again, remarkably similar to the Essene. The Essene, again, who was remarkably similar to the Catholic/Oriental monks. In fact, Josephus's descriptions of this Banus could have been seemingly interchanged with a practitioner of any Eastern or Western monastic life. I agree with Mason that Josephus's attitude and commentary make it clear he was no Pharisee, and he was certainly no Sadducee either. Perhaps Josephus was just a monastic Dominican born 15 centuries too early. Highlights of Chapter 5. Early Christian figures mentioned by Josephus. At the outset, it must be stated that the figures contained in Josephus that can be reasonably tied to the New Testament are pathetically few and with very little information on them. One would expect far more if either Josephus or the New Testament were accurate accounts of history in the first century. This conspicuous disparity was the first thing that struck me when I went about the task of reading the Whiston translations years ago. Secondly, I was struck by how much antiquities departed from the Law and Prophets. Thirdly, I was struck down with incurable boredom, and this is never a state I find myself in with any work that's both truthful and relevant. One should ponder why any serious Bible student would find Josephus complimentary to the text. The first thing that should strike anyone interested in Josephus as an enhancement of Bible studies is what we find Mason offering on page 213 concerning John the Baptist, Jesus, and Jesus' brother James. Quote, "All three occur only in the closing volumes of the Antiquities, 18 through 20, closed quote. Now, besides the fact that the entirety of Christian figures referenced in Antiquities are only found in the last 10% of Antiquities, their precise references, as we will see, are so minute and disconnected from the rest of Josephus that one could easily believe they were inserted altogether after the original Josephan books were written, thus interpolations. And why these odd impositions? Because if Christianity was already established among the yeomen, and the chief aims of Josephus were to 1. Change the law and prophets into religion and philosophy, 2. Elevate establishment history and geography over biblical history and geography, and 3. To transform Israel, Judah into the Jew, those who indeed wrote and published Josephus would need some sort of Christian hooks or bait to draw the yeoman reader in for the switch. All other details paralleling but not agreeing with the New Testament would simply work to keep nothing about history concrete and sure, while engendering constant doubt in the reader. Both work very well for the establishment's control. John the Baptist. Although Mason seems not to see a disparity regarding the cause of John's arrest between the Gospels and Josephus, Josephus claiming it was due to John's great eloquence from page 216, he writes on page 217, quote, "To put it bluntly, Josephus does not see John as a figure in the Christian tradition. The Baptist is not connected with early Christianity in any way," closed quote. This is truly odd in the extreme. Even if Josephus did not agree with early Christianity under whatever name it's claimed to have had, to not connect the Baptist with Jesus and Christianity illustrates an insurmountable barrier between Josephus and the New Testament. Mason, to his credit, lists extensive New Testament quotes concerning the vital role of John the Baptist in Christianity on subsequent pages, then writes with sanitary veracity on page 219, quote, "Josephus mentions nothing of John's association with Jesus," closed quote. Cue the mouths to all now drop open. After providing a 5-page apology to soften the harsh blow of his Christian customers for the lack of corresponding New Testament material on John the Baptist within Josephus, Mason then caps it all with, quote, "In this case, it is the Gospels that provide important background for understanding Josephus," closed quote. I could nearly compliment Mason on this clever sleight of hand if it weren't for the fact that it only serves to draw the reader's attention away from the cold, hard truth that, concerning John the Baptist, the one New Testament character most highlighted by Josephus, there is no harmony at all between Josephus and the New Testament. In typical Mason form, he ends the section on John with, quote, "We ought not to treat Josephus as a kind of fact book," closed quote, which is so outlandishly obtuse that I must comment. That being the case, why not figure the works of Josephus as entirely fictional? I believe the answer is found in my above 3 points concerning the aims of Josephus, and it would appear the aims of many others supporting Josephus. Jesus, a wise man. This one is not, in my humble, unlettered, uninitiated opinion, even remotely close enough to anything even quasi-Christianesque enough to justify the copious amounts of lauding and pushing of Josephus onto Christians. I do, however, appreciate Mason presenting much of the meat of this issue, first cited over a century ago, yet widely unknown by the Josephan disciple. Mason first cites an issue with the one single passage in Josephus connecting his voluminous works to Christ or Christianity. On page 226, he presents the Testimonium Flavianum, which, as paragraphs go, is the lonesome singular dewdrop in the tumultuous sea of Josephus. Mason notes the oddity of the sequence within which Jesus is mentioned in Josephus, coming before John the Baptist, and also in what seems to be a disjointed sequence of complaints concerning Pontius Pilate. Due to the importance of this passage, I will reproduce it herein and afterward condense Mason's observations. Quote, "About this time comes Jesus, a wise man, if indeed it is proper to call him a man, for he was a worker of incredible deeds, a teacher of those who accept the truth with pleasure, and he attracted many Jews as well as many of the Greek way. This man was the Christ, And when in view of his denunciation by the leading men among us, Pilate had sentenced him to a cross, those who had loved him at the beginning did not cease to do so. He appeared to them on the third day alive again, for the divine prophets had announced these and countless other marvels concerning him. And even now the tribe of the Christians, named after him, has not yet disappeared. Closed quote. From Josephus and Whiston, Antiquities 1863 and 64. The first thing Mason points out concerning the numerous problems within this passage is when the criticism about it started. He writes on page 227, quote, "Scholars first noticed them in the 16th century," closed quote, yet he provides no 16th century work. His first verifiable reference is from a late 19th century author, E. Gerlach, whose cited work has never been translated into English that I'm aware of. He also cites 87 more studies done on the topic in the 19th century. It puzzles me why the scholars waited so long if Josephus had been around for at least a few centuries before the 1800s, or rather 18 centuries before the 1800s. Over the next few pages, Mason illuminates the many issues with the Greek terminology used in said passage, as well as the conflict of interests that may have played a role. 1. The problem with the Koine term Christ, from page 228. May I say that if Josephus is willing to offer Jesus to the reader as Christ, why is he entirely absent from the rest of Josephus? If I were willing to call a man the Christ, you could count on additional materials and citations concerning him. Point 2, the problem with lack of original manuscript, from page 229. And this one is huge. Did the first copy have any information on any of these New Testament characters? I guess we'll never know, and not knowing combined with the disagreement between them and Josephus is, again in my opinion, enough to keep anyone serious about the actual truth at least arm's distance away from Josephus. And 3, the sources used to cite Josephus: Eusebius, Jerome, Michael the Patriarch, and Agapius, from pages 230 and 231. Regarding this point, and of utmost importance, none of these sources agree. And not just on Josephan information, but on all manner of items of the greatest importance if we are to seriously consider them or Josephus as actual history. Actual history is not impressionist art. Either Mr. X met Mr. Y at location Z on day 1, or he did not. Actual history, real history, is also neither a broad palette of grays and taupes that many may waft through and pull from at random. If there is no agreement among the previously noted authors, nor of any establishment-approved historians, if we're being honest and thorough, then one or more must be wrong, or a liar, and therefore untrustworthy, or perhaps their common source is incorrect. Thus again, they are all wrong and are therefore all untrustworthy. Furthermore, Christ or Christos is not the only problematic term. At the top of page 232, Mason writes, quote, Josephus uses the word tribe or phile 11 other times. Once it denotes gender, and once a swarm of locusts, but it usually signifies distinct peoples, races, and nationalities. The Jews are a tribe, as are the Taurians and Parthians. Closed quote. This is a reference to Josephus calling the Christians a tribe. This is not unlike the purported Jesuit initiation oath citing the Christians as a race, quote, in order to annihilate forever their execrable race, closed quote. Is it not strange that Josephus goes to great lengths to convince his readers that Judaism is a religion, yet when he has the chance to cite a thing that most would affirm as a religion, he calls it a tribe? And what was his meaning when he cited how Jesus drew in both Jews and Greeks? Is that implying a definition of tribal or religious ways? Unfortunately, this doesn't appear to be answerable. Mason doesn't use Whiston's translation, Jews and Gentiles, from Antiquities 18:3-3, but insists on Greek way, which seems to dull even further the peculiarity of Josephus calling Christians a tribe. However, over the next few pages, Mason does greatly elaborate on all the very real issues in the Testimonium Flavianum, and for that, I find no fault. James, the brother of Jesus. On page 237, Mason once again reminds us that none of these three New Testament characters were ever at the forefront of anything in Josephus. He writes, quote, "He, being Josephus, says very little about this man James, but the fact that he mentions him incidentally is strong support for the authenticity of this passage," closed quote. I cannot help but think of what little we saw mentioned about Jesus, and so why wouldn't this mention of James be open to speculation as a possible interpolation as well? One must truly wonder why there is constant support from Mason in favor of Josephus as a serious source when he goes on to write such things as, quote, "Evidently, consistency does not matter to Josephus. Everything serves his present rhetorical needs," closed quote. And I, as a mere reader, am overwhelmed by the imagery of a courtroom. Your Honor, I motion to dismiss all other witnesses and proceed directly to Josephus's well-deserved sentencing. From this point on, it is my opinion that more citation of Mason is unnecessary. Mason presses forward like a real soldier to convince us of Josephus's dishonesty while still legitimizing his work. Perhaps a two-faced coin on the cover of Mason's book would have been more appropriate. Mason spends a great deal of time illustrating the mention of James, his affiliation with Jesus, and the Josephan context of the mention of James. I will compliment Mason on noting that even the New Testament, Acts in particular, does not help us explain how this James, the brother of Jesus, became head of the Jerusalem church. After all, wouldn't an apostle such as Peter, for instance, be a wiser choice? Yet from out of nowhere, Jesus' brother James, who was not with him all those years of ministry, is suddenly the head of the Jerusalem church, according to Luke and Paul. Even if we take this as absolute fact, one should take time to consider it, and while considering, also ponder the term nepotism. I, for one, have no real issue with such nepotism, since I know the edicts of the law and prophets concerning bloodlines, but I imagine any Christian would see such an odd appointment as a real problem. Besides, there were still Levites, and we do have genealogies in both Matthew and Luke. Aren't they supposed to be operating on the maxims of, quote, neither Jew nor Greek, closed quote, from Galatians 3:28, and, quote, no respecter of persons, closed quote, from Romans 2:11, and etc., and so on, in these New Testament days? This seems highly unorthodox in the light of all we've come to be taught of Christianity, but entirely orthodox in Old Testament practice. Now there is a paradox worth pondering. In summing up this chapter on page 248, Mason writes a very true, though very sobering statement. Quote, Josephus's account of Jesus provides little direct help because the version that we find in our manuscripts of Josephus's works is almost certainly corrupt. Nevertheless, the exercise of analyzing that passage is useful for making us aware of the many stages through which all ancient texts have passed before reaching us." Closed quote. I agree. It's very useful, and yet I must wonder why these many stages through which all ancient texts have passed are acceptable, and why most academics still treat these texts with such reverence, that being the case. A nutritionist would tell you to stay away from processed foods, but an academic continually entices us with processed texts. This present comparison I believe to be very accurate and appropriate. Highlights of Chapter 6, Josephus and Luke Acts. Finally, after wading through 250 pages of information such that needs an advocate the caliber of Steve Mason to reinforce our great need for Josephus, we finally reach the well-earned and by now highly coveted Chapter 6. Mason sets out by illuminating the disparities, and there are so very many, between Luke and Matthew/Mark, which are also highlighted in the OBRY project series, Let's Consider Luke. Mason does not outright say this, so I may as well, that the issues between Luke and Matthew/Mark are so frequent and noteworthy that even calling Luke one of the synoptics, as in taking the same point of view, is misleading at best. On page 251, Mason points out that the greatest number of academics drawing parallels between Josephus and Luke Acts are German and from the 19th century. Again, most of these have not been translated into English, as with so many important German works. I can't help thinking that the reason for so much German criticism, and in the 19th century, is that Josephus may have been one of the centerpieces of the Prussian education reform of the 18th and 19th centuries mentioned earlier, which is one of the most remarkable stories of compulsory schooling I've ever heard outside that implemented in the United States, the U.S. program being the direct descendant of its Prussian grandfather. Generic parallels. On page 252, Mason begins to show us the stylistic similarities between Luke Acts and not merely Josephus, but the Hellenistic method, a style of writing, as Mason cites, sourced in the works of Herodotus, Thucydides, and Polybius. And though I agree there certainly are stylistic similarities in these works, I do not, however, agree with Mason's depiction of Herodotus being all that scientific, nor with the efficacy of Thucydides' witness method, in contrast to more substantial evidence, nor of Polybius following the tune of the previous two to be taken as a good sign. But, once again, their style and form are of great importance when looking at Luke Acts and Josephus, as we will see. The first telling point raised by Mason on page 253 is, as he states, quote, "An indispensable feature of any Hellenistic history book was the prologue, in contrast to the Hebrew scriptures, which tend to jump right into the narration of events." Closed quote. That statement is quite accurate and can be easily confirmed. This is a bigger sign of treachery than one might imagine. The style of an author is so unique, like that of an artist. It's akin even to fingerprints, vocal tone and pattern, or habit. And if God, via inspiration, is writing these books, there should be no radical departure in style. In the course of further articulating this particular style, Mason cites these telltale features of a typical Hellenistic preface that would include remarks on 1. The subject and its importance, 2. The inadequacy of previous histories of this period, 3. The author's circumstances and reasons for writing, 4. The author's complete impartiality and concern for the truth. 5. The author's strenuous research efforts and access to eyewitness testimony. 6. The author's thesis, including a view of the causes of the events in question. And 7. Occasionally a brief outline of the work's contents. On page 254, Mason now cites the way in which Josephus uses this type of preface in War. He then quotes Luke 1:1-4, illustrating that Luke employs these major stylistic points as well. When one reads the two back-to-back, which I highly recommend, the similarities are remarkable. Besides the fact that this form is found nowhere else in the Old Testament scriptures, there also doesn't appear to be even a concept in the biblical OBRY mindset, which allows degenerate texts to circulate to the point at which a better, more accurate one would need to be produced, such as we see in so many Hellenistic texts. One must appreciate Mason's shrewd treatment of Luke's introduction. By looking closer at the verbiage used in Koine Greek, Mason extracts a clearer picture of what is being stated in Luke's introduction to his gospel. On pages 255 through 256, Mason demonstrates that we are seeing an introduction which ticks the boxes of the Hellenistic style reproduced above. Acknowledging in general the gospel accounts which came before it, Luke's account is, at the same time, claiming more accuracy and therefore trustworthiness than those that came before his, namely the two far more Old Testament harmonious accounts of Matthew and Mark. To reinforce the scope of Luke's departure, Mason gives us a few Koine terms which can be missed in the translation to English. Luke's author is claiming that only his gospel is asphelia, a secure basis, and being accomplished kathexis in an orderly manner. For anyone who has carefully compared Matthew/Mark to Luke, these claims serve only to enhance the disagreement, as Luke is frequently and alarmingly out of order with the other two. On page 257, Mason demonstrates that both Luke Acts and Josephus make dedications to what appear to be patrons. In my view, this probability in both authors represents a very real obstacle to any author endeavoring to create an entirely unbiased, unencumbered account. Often publishers will specify a topic to a contractual author. The author then writes per their specification. He lends his talent to the task of manifesting their desired ends. Why would any patron, at any time, represent anything differently? Rich and powerful people like to stay rich and powerful, and their actions, including the financing of anything, reflect this desire. On page 259, speaking of the author of Luke Acts, Mason offers, quote, although both author and audience were evidently somewhat removed from Judea, given the author's defective knowledge of the geography, closed quote. Then Mason cites three examples, Luke 5:19, 12:55, and 17:11. I would agree, while adding that Luke's author either has defective knowledge of the land of Palestine or that he wasn't writing about the land of Palestine at all. Josephian geography is a topic in itself, but since Mason does bring up Luke's issues, I will follow suit. However, the examples Mason gives here seem such a waste of an extraordinary opportunity. Example number 1, quote, for he was amazed, and all who were with him, at the catch of the fish which they had caught, closed quote, from Luke 5:9. And this point has nothing to do with geography. Perhaps it was a typo or simple error we were supposed to ignore. Example 2, quote, when a south wind blows, you say, there will be a scorching heat. And it happens, closed quote, from Luke 12:55. But the south wind does bring warmth, and the prevailing winds in Palestine shift from coming from the northeast to coming from the southwest. There's no oddity or error here either. In example 3, quote, as he was on his way to Jerusalem, he was passing along the borders of Samaria and Galilee, closed quote, from Luke 17:11. Finally, somewhat appropriate, if Mason could argue that the author was claiming that Jesus passed first through Samaria and then Galilee on his way to Jerusalem. But far better opportunities to illustrate Luke's issues with geography can be found in these being my own examples. Example 1, quote, they were all filled with wrath in the synagogue as they heard these things. They rose up, threw him out of the city, and led him to the brow of the hill that their city was built on, that they might throw him off the cliff. But he, passing through the middle of them, went his way, closed quote, from Luke 4:28 through 30. The brow of the hill mentioned is the Nazarene cliff account found only in Luke. The site in Palestine near the purported town of Nazareth, where this account is said to have occurred, is called the Mountain of the Precipitation. It is a full mile and a half outside of town and quite tedious to get to. It seems very illogical to go to such great lengths to kill Jesus, as there were likely stones lying all about the synagogue with which to stone him. In this case, the proximity of the precipice to the site of the town is noteworthy. This next example serves to further illustrate Luke's geographical issues as it relates to the path of Jesus to Jerusalem. Example 2, quote, it came to pass, when the days were near that he should be taken up, he intently set his face to go to Jerusalem, closed quote, Luke 9:51. At this point, Jesus is in Galilee, as referenced in Luke 9:10 and 9:52. He goes through Samaria, Luke 9:51 through 56. Then somehow he had time to send out 72 disciples and have them return, Luke 10:1 through 20. And then, quote, as they went on their way, he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. She had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word, closed quote, from Luke 10:38 and 39. Now, Martha and Mary are from Bethany, as referenced in John 11:1 through 5 and 12:1 through 3. Bethany is near Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives, as per Luke 19:29. The purported sites of Bethany and the Mount of Olives, as can be viewed on any Bible atlas or Google Earth, are but a stone's throw away from Jerusalem. The Mount of Olives is across a small depression from Jerusalem, and Bethany is on its eastern slope. However, quote, he went on his way through cities and villages, teaching and traveling on to Jerusalem, closed quote, from Luke 13:22. But last we knew, Jesus was in Bethany, right next door to Jerusalem, on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, not even 2 miles away. It is quite impossible to conceive of anything other than a few buildings and landscape, given the uneven terrain between the geographical location of Bethany and Jerusalem. The path becomes even more intangible from there. According to the text, Jesus had no plans of going anywhere but Jerusalem, as stated back in Luke 9:51. Note the following verses, which are given in sequential order. Example 3. Quote, as he was on his way to Jerusalem, he was passing along the borders of Samaria and Galilee, closed quote, Luke 17:11. Quote, he took the 12 aside and said to them, behold, we are going to Jerusalem, and all the things that are written through the prophets concerning the Son of Man will be completed, closed quote, Luke 18:31. Quote, As he came near Jericho, a certain blind man sat by the road begging, closed quote, Luke 18:35. Quote, he entered and was passing through Jericho, closed quote, Luke 19:1. Quote, he ran on ahead and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way, closed quote, Luke 19:4. Quote, as they heard these things, he went on and told a parable, because he was near Jerusalem, and they supposed that God's kingdom would be revealed immediately. Closed quote, Luke 19:11. Quote, having said these things, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. Closed quote, Luke 19:28. Quote, when he came near to Bethphage and Bethany at the mountain that is called Olivet, he sent 2 of his disciples. Closed quote from Luke 19:29. Quote, as he was now getting near at the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to rejoice and praise God with a loud voice for all the mighty works which they had seen. Closed quote from Luke 19:37. And quote, when he came near, he saw the city and wept over it. Close quote from Luke 19:41. All of these sequential verses seem to present Jericho as though it is on the way to Jerusalem. This is not so, and no reason is given for Jesus going through Jericho in order to travel from Galilee to Jerusalem. It is quite difficult to travel through and out of the rocky hills of Middle Palestine, off the road leading from the presumed locale of Samaria to Jerusalem, into the Gore Valley and Jericho, then trek back up from there to Jerusalem. This Gore Valley, being the colloquial name for the Jordan River Valley, is famous for its extreme heat. No one travels there if it's not necessary, nor would many choose to travel in the Gore Valley from the area of the Sea of Galilee due to the heat, unless it was a vital necessity. It's murderously hot and oppressive most of the year, and even if they had chosen that brutal route, they wouldn't technically be going through Galilee and Samaria. Incidentally, there is no mention of the Gore Valley nor of its unbearable heat in either the New or Old Testaments. And finally, as the fourth and last of my own examples concerning geography, there are literally hundreds of cities and suburbs mentioned in the tribal territories throughout the Old Testament. Judah alone has well in excess of 100, not including suburbs and districts from Joshua chapter 15. However, both Luke and Josephus seem only to focus on a very few locales, most of which have no confirmed Old Testament counterparts. If one wished not to be caught in a lie, one would stay far away from the details that were too easily verifiable. Over the next few pages, Mason shows a marked similarity between Josephus and Acts in the mode of speeches delivered by their characters. Mason demonstrates the ways in which both Josephus and Luke Acts used speeches to obtain a rhetorical end rather than using plain text to chronicle an historical record. I must wonder if anyone would wish to see these sorts of techniques used in a book relaying facts. Perhaps, as Mason suggests concerning Josephus, we shouldn't look at Luke Acts as a fact book either. But if we do not, where does that lead us? Unfortunately, Mason won't take us that far, so I will. It likely leads us to the possession of a far smaller New Testament, and I mean a far, far smaller one. But is that a bad thing? I would suggest it's only bad if our goal is merely to maintain the New Testament exactly as it is, no matter the cost to truth and accuracy. On page 263, Mason points out the way in which the characters of Peter, Paul, and Stephen sound strikingly similar in the book of Acts, though I would add that via at least Peter and Paul's epistles, we see two very different characters. It's akin to the song's melody remaining the same while the key shifts from start to finish, from major to minor. As well, we see a drastic shift in casting. Jesus' hand-picked apostles begin with spotlight and authority and choose a replacement for Judas as per Acts 1. However, 9 chapters in, and Luke has presented the story concerning Saul of Tarsus taking the place of Peter, along with his fluctuating Damascus conversion story in Acts 9, 1 through 9, 22, 6 through 21, and 26, 12 through 18. On page 264, Mason then offers, quote, "The story of Paul's shipwreck, Acts 27, is similar to an episode Josephus tells about himself, Life 14 through 16, and reflects the common theme of divine protection at sea," closed quote. And again, quote, "Paul's encounter with the snake, Acts 27, in which he survives what should have been a fatal bite, was a common motif in the literature of the period," closed quote. He draws parallels between the judgments seen in Acts and those in Josephus. He even reminds us on the next page how similar the precocious youth story from Luke is to Josephus's own claims about himself. On page 265, Mason notes how both Josephus and Acts, quote, "deal with the major political theme of the day, the rise of Roman power and various conflicts along the way," closed quote. And to this day, the church at large believes there was a major shift from Israel-Judah to the Gentiles, encapsulated in Luke's book of Acts, continued in the letters of Saul/Paul, and then forwarded in the church fathers, ancient historians, and Roman Catholic mythos. Afterward, this idea remained with the reformers and forward to today. The shifts in Acts are numerous. Here are a few. 1. The rejection of the gospel and the stoning of Stephen by the Jews. Again, in actuality, this would be the Judeos, or Judah, from Acts 6 and 7. 2. The conversion of Samaritans, magicians, and Ethiopians, from Acts 8. 3. The conversion of Saul and the blinding light thereof, from Acts 9. 4. Peter's vision, Cornelius, and the Holy Spirit falling on the Gentiles, Acts 10. 5. The Jerusalem church weakens, Acts 12. And 6. Saul takes the spotlight, Acts 13 forward. And the many deeds of Saul end squarely in Rome with absolutely no resolution. Perhaps that cryptic ending is where the church or Israel as the church or vice versa picks up. Or perhaps that's where anyone inserts whatever pleases them into the subsequent narrative and accompanying ideologies. This is where replacement theology comes in, the backbone of Catholic and Protestant dogma, and entirely impossible without Cornelius, Stephen's stoning, the Ethiopian, and St. Paul's conversion and ministry to the Greeks. This entire twist to the Bible must hinge its center point on the works of St. Luke. Indeed, Acts, which is the last purported historical narrative we have from the canon, begins in the land the entire Bible, including the covenants, focuses around, and yet finishes solidly in Rome. Mason inevitably echoes this on page 269. While demonstrating the disparity in the message of various Gospels, he writes concerning Luke's Gospel, quote, by showing that although Christianity began deeply embedded in Judaism with Jesus, the apostles, and even Luke's Paul, God has shown through a series of revelations that it must open itself also to the Gentiles, closed quote. The it in that sentence is Christianity, which begins as a tribe, even according to Josephus, but ends in Acts as a religion, and now within the current epicenter of Western religion, even Rome. The parallels between Josephus and Luke Acts in type and depth of the paradigm shift are remarkable. On page 270, Mason again assures us, quote, like Josephus, Luke must also show that his religion is not opposed to Roman order, though it seems to be from the outside, closed quote. And to that, I amend, like Josephus, Luke must also present the Bible as religion. Remember the Essenes from earlier? Mason writes on page 271, quote, as for moral teachings and lifestyle, the church appears very much like the Essene community of Josephus, sharing all things in common, expressing great love for one another, and living upright lives. Like the Essenes, they pose no political threat, closed quote. Yes. Fascinating. However, I might rather have phrased it as the Catholic form of the church when in comparison to the Essenes, although it truly is unfair of me to distinguish Protestants from Catholics, at least in core beliefs. What's more, I would point out that unlike the Essenes and their Christian counterparts, as well as Josephus's Jews, the Israel-Judah of the law and prophets were anything but non-threatening to the powers seeking to rule over them. A lawful Israel fought oppressors. A lawful Israel did not seek to oppress others in their own lands. Moreover, a lawful Israel has Yahweh fighting for them. How can the church really be a faithful people and yet so non-threatening? And if they are who they claim to be, how can Josephus's Jews be so zealous for the law, all the while under the boot of two subsequent empires? Both Josephus and Luke Acts pose a serious conundrum, which has been touched on but bears repeating. In both, we encounter a fairly large number of Jews who are zealous for the law. This is in such radical opposition to the ever unfaithful Israel-Judah we see throughout the Old Testament. One would be hard-pressed to find one truly decent and righteous leader or citizen throughout much of the Old Testament records. Therefore, we now have the nagging difficulty of reconciling why, if there are so many Judahites zealous for the law, were they still under such an occupation. And between Luke Acts and Josephus, there appear to be copious numbers of Jews zealous for the law. As earlier stated, the covenant at Horeb was dependent on the keeping of the law. Why weren't they free? Why were these people, presented by Josephus and Luke as zealous for the law, not at peace, living in fear and strife, under the yoke of the sword, and chased and oppressed by their enemies? Does this picture of a lawfully zealous Jew match with Scripture? Well, let's see. Quote, if you walk in my statutes and keep my commandments and do them, I will give you peace in the land, and you shall lie down, and no one will make you afraid. I will remove evil animals out of your land. Neither shall the sword go through your land. You shall chase your enemies, and they shall fall before you by the sword. Closed quote. From Leviticus 26:3 and 6 through 7. Additionally, since Josephus paints most of his Judean or Judean as decent and lawful, and that's a good thing in his eyes, why paint the rigidly lawful Sadducees in such a bad light? Furthermore, if the Sadducees and other leaders were so rigidly lawful, Why were they portrayed so often at enmity with Christ and Christians? Jesus, after all, said, quote, "Don't think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I didn't come to destroy, but to fulfill. For most certainly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not even one smallest letter or one tiny pen stroke shall in any way pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. Whoever therefore shall break one of these least commandments and teach others to do so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whosoever shall do and teach them shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, there is no way you will enter into the kingdom of heaven." Closed quote from Matthew 5:17 through 20. Jesus didn't include the Sadducees in that last statement. On page 273, Mason assembles a very well-executed list of people and event parallels between Josephus and Luke Acts spanning the next 10 pages. On page 273, he writes, quote, "More than any other gospel writer, Luke includes references to the non-Christian world of affairs," closed quote. Mason then covers the census under Quirinius from pages 273 through 277 and Judas the Galilean, Theudas, and the Egyptian prophet from pages 277 through 282, which are two matters only to be found between Josephus and Luke Acts. The other details Mason offers connecting Josephus and Luke Acts are too numerous and too technical to reproduce herein, though there is one matter of paramount importance that must be expanded. The census recorded by Josephus and Luke, which is such a crucial factor on why or how Jesus ends up in Bethlehem at birth, strangely, is to be found nowhere else. If Jesus' birth in Bethlehem was said to be prophetic, as in, quote, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, being small among the clans of Judah, out of you one will come out to me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from ancient times," closed quote, from Micah 5:2, and then echoed in, quote, "You, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are in no way least among the princes of Judah, for out of you shall come a governor who shall shepherd my people Israel," closed quote, Matthew 2:6. Would it not be important to cite how this Nazarene wound up being born in Bethlehem? Matthew provides the most detail outside of Luke and only mentions in Matthew 2:1 that Jesus' birth was in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. There is no Quirinius nor Caesar Augustus mentioned. Mark and John both begin at the ministry of John the Baptist, but even John illustrates the importance of Christ being born in Bethlehem. Quote, "Others said, 'This is the Christ,' but some said, 'What? Does the Christ come out of Galilee? Hasn't the scripture said that the Christ comes of the offspring of David and from Bethlehem, the village where David was?'" Closed quote, John 7:41 and 42. Yet, Matthew, Mark, and John all fail to record this detail so vitally important to this Galilean born at Bethlehem. If they were trying to argue Jesus' messianic authenticity, they could all cite the census and the records that must have existed then. John doesn't even offer something such as, "But they didn't realize that his parents were in Bethlehem for the census." This absence of reasons in 3 of the 4 Gospels is perplexing in the extreme. On page 282, Mason briefly lists minor parallels, which seem to one who has examined the contrast between Luke's Gospel and the other 2 synoptics, such as I have, just as important as the major ones. These parallels mainly consist of common persons shared by Josephus and Luke Acts, and details thereof, stylistic similarities in rhetoric, and Luke's version of Jesus' description of the destruction of the temple. All could and perhaps should be given more space or additional study by the reader. Lastly, beginning on page 283, we encounter a section that cuts right to the heart of the matter, agreements of theme and vocabulary. This 9-page coup de grace is precisely what I, a biblical student and linguist, have been anticipating for exactly 283 pages. Mason tells us on page 283, quote, "The literary aims of Josephus have until recent years been largely ignored, while those of Luke have been hotly debated." Closed quote. I find that statement odd. Concerning Luke, I can find few resources that appear even remotely unbiased in Luke's or the New Testament's favor, and when I do find apparent opponents to Luke, they are without exception absolutely true believers in that shaky establishment history I've been mentioning throughout. Few of them really open up all the obvious festering wounds in Luke Acts, and absolutely none of them touch establishment history. I will say, I did find Mason's statement on Josephus immensely believable, if we ignore all the German authors whose books seem to be far too much of a bother for anyone to translate. On page 284, Mason makes what I consider an obvious comparison of the two authors as he writes, quote, "Josephus offers by far the most comprehensive attempt to interpret the whole of Jewish culture, its origins, history, leading figures, ethics, and religious groups in philosophical terms," closed quote. And then, quote, "Luke seems to present early Christianity as a philosophical school within the Jewish orbit," closed quote. These observations stand as endorsements of what I've been claiming throughout, that they both change the law and prophets into religion and philosophy. And from pages 284 through 291, I applaud all the comparisons Mason offers between Luke Acts and the ancient Greek historians and philosophers, which again illustrate Luke Acts' distinctly Hellenistic method and style. In the conclusion, on page 291, Mason gives us a whirlwind of absolutely zero commitment. He begins with, quote, "Luke Acts is unique among the New Testament writings in the extent of its affinities with Josephus's narratives," closed quote. But then he rolls on to write, quote, "These similarities of literary type do not require that Luke knew Josephus's work," closed quote, which, yes, I suppose I can agree with. However, in the next paragraph, Mason twirls back with, quote, "More suggestive of a relationship between the works is the striking number of incidents reported in common," closed quote. These back and forth ricocheting statements are no small matter, because now we're on Mason's roller coaster. On the next page, he plummets into, quote, "Luke's product is much more difficult to explain if he had no knowledge of Josephus," closed quote. And when these and all the rest of the crests and valleys, hairpin turns and barrel rolls throughout the whole of this book are considered, one is justified in feeling a bit motion sick by the end. I would offer this plain, unwinding statement. Given the problems of consistency we've seen with Josephus's works and those of Luke Acts as compared with the other Gospels, along with no solid biblical corroboration of them, it's almost certain that we are looking at a derivative work in either Josephus or Luke, or both being derivative of a third work. The idea of a third source, or simply a goal from which both parties worked, is tenable, considering all the ways in which both intended to satisfy a similar end. And since that similar end is at odds with the Old Testament, to which they both give only lip service but do not echo in practice, it's also reasonable to believe they didn't arrive at the end organically. Perhaps, since their creation, an original third source may have proved too problematic to keep in circulation. I would say this explanation is far more reasonable and believable than Mason's perpetually spongy maybes, perhapses, and we may never knows. Mason caps his conclusion with one or two more maybe yes and maybe no statements, thereby leaving his reader not much closer to finding the asphalia, or secure basis, of this matter. He leaves us with no solid resolutions apart from the supposed grave errors and crimes of the Christians themselves. If nothing else, appropriate Christian shame will resound in the reader's subconscious for quite some time. Highlights of conclusion. The significance of Josephus for New Testament study. Mason writes an apt conclusion in the sense that it appropriately sums up the thoroughly non-committal tone throughout. On page 297, almost echoing an Area 51 tour guide, Mason boasts, quote, "My goal, therefore, was to sketch out a map of this territory to indicate some highlights and features not to be missed. If successful, this tour guide will have left more questions than answers, along with a desire to explore the territory for oneself." Closed quote. This seems like a well-balanced, non-biased approach until we go back and revisit all of his statements that clearly support the official narrative of history while slandering Christians and elevating Jews. His opinion is demonstrably biased, and not merely in an academically overt way. It, like so many biases, comes through in the subtext when, for one, treating so many questionable sources as reliable. When Mason boasts the previous quip, quote, "If successful, this tour guide will have left more questions than answers," closed quote, I must wonder how deliberate the unanswered questions may be. When he finishes with, quote, "along with a desire to explore the territory for oneself," closed quote, then I wonder how anyone is expected to truly explore within the confines established within the mindset and materiel, that's EL at the end of materiel as opposed to material, AL, that treats Herodotus, Josephus, Eusebius, and Jerome as serious sources. Anytime Mason is forced to spotlight the problems between these sources, they are quickly followed by the typical cleanup statements illustrated herein. On the same page, Mason resumes, quote, "All history is, at bottom, someone's formulation of the past. It usually happens that we find the first maps offered to us defective. As we experience the territory in question, we see things that were not on the map and routes that are no longer open. But none of this diminishes the need for a map in the first place." Closed quote. Considering that most reading Mason or Josephus, and especially Luke Acts, are either Bible believers or biblically interested, I'd ask what the importance of 2 Peter 1:20 is, quote, "knowing this first, that no prophecy of Scripture is of private interpretation," closed quote. Why is it so important that we do not allow someone's own personal formulation when interpreting Scripture? Because it's a matter of purported truth and fact, and therefore of life and behavior. If similarly one believes and acts upon lies or mistakes of history, one will often produce or receive negative and even disastrous results. If the foundations of knowledge are flawed, then we need to draw the map from scratch or use far better sources when they may be determined to be such, if we hope to navigate virtually anything at all. This appears to be what Mason is alluding to at the close of his statement, though I wonder if he'd support a vigorous skepticism towards all of the defective sources offered herein. An example of absolutely deliberate hyperbole is this. How many would even attempt to fly an airplane were it told to them, aviation is at bottom someone's formulation of how flying ought to work? The understanding of air pressure, lift, aerodynamics, and the controls and safety features of the plane are not something we have perfected just yet, but we would like to see you get that plane up in the air, and you can figure everything out once you're up and flying. A lack of historical knowledge, or bad historical knowledge, isn't simply having inadequate maps. It's having maps that show a garden resting where, in reality, there is an abyss. The Prussian education reformists, which set the current Western standard in compulsory schooling, knew the most dangerous people were those who could think and reason within a backdrop of properly contextualized history. And here we are, marching confidently forward to disaster with Mason's defective maps and with Mason's blessings. How can anyone know where they are or where they are going without knowing from whence they came? To be clear, just because mere men record history, this does not automatically mean we should expect it to be defective. Men can do marvelous deeds and refine them down to a very small margin of error. Thank God we did it with aviation. Emotional mind control via television and film are down to an exact science, as is prediction through algorithms. Man has the ability to improve, refine, and sharpen to a brilliance any pursuit put before him, but somehow we cannot expect the same level of skillful craftsmanship from recorded history. And we're being told by the likes of Mason that this is normal, to be expected and embraced. We are just expected to simply concede and receive the elaborately inharmonious, often slapstick, and most definitely inapplicable to anything even bordering on reality texts of the so-called ancients, and just trust that the academics of the world, such as Mason, have our best interests at heart. Continuing from there onto page 298, Mason teases, quote, "We said almost nothing, for example, about the versions of the Bible used by Josephus and the New Testament authors, about Josephus on the historical geography of Palestine, the temple and its service, the economic and social conditions of Jerusalem, Galilean history and geography, the Samaritans, the Jewish communities of the diaspora, or about numerous other topics that are pertinent to the study of the New Testament." Close quote. Yes. A deep study into virtually any one of these topics would reveal far greater and fresher fruits, as opposed to filling hundreds of pages with Josephine facts. But, recalling Mason's earlier quip, quote, "We ought not to treat Josephus as a kind of fact book," closed quote. I have the feeling were Mason to treat any one of those other topics, we would end up at the same dreary destination. In the very next paragraph, it's back to an apology for Josephus. Mason swoons, quote, "He, Josephus, did not intend to be a witness to the truth of Christianity. He was a man of at least moderate intelligence who wrote because he had stories to tell," closed quote. I could say the same for Stephen King, Roald Dahl, or J.D. Salinger, and I won't take their word for it regarding history either. If Christianity in the first century was what we see in the New Testament, and Josephus did indeed live and write in that century, in Judea, why would he go out of his way to ignore such a paramount upheaval? If someone has mere stories to tell, that's fine. But please, Mr. Mason, don't treat them as anything but stories. Ink flows just as readily from the pen of the liar as it does from the pen of the just. When Mason reiterates, quote, he didn't write some kind of fact book from which we can cut and paste, closed quote, I have to suspect the motives of one such as Mason, who has treated the works of Flavius Josephus as some kind of fact book from which he has cut and pasted throughout the last 300 pages worth of time taken from my finite life. On page 299, once again, defending his storyteller, Mason claims, quote, everyone who recounts the past necessarily interprets it. This means that the historical questions, what really happened? What were these people really like? So far remain largely unanswered, closed quote. This aptly illustrates the great need for independent, unencumbered criticism of these establishment-approved historical sources. If one is honestly citing these interpretations as conjecture open to vigorous criticism, fair enough. But when the author or any other agency promotes a book of interpretations, defective formulations, and paltry stories as factual, historical, and reliable, it's beyond misrepresentation. And never mind Mason for just a moment. Josephus himself claims to be factual. In War, he writes concerning the Romans and Jews, quote, I will prosecute the actions of both parties with accuracy, closed quote, from War Preface 4, Whiston translation. He indeed spends much of the preface of War criticizing all but himself and those in league with him. Quote, yet shall the real truth of historical facts be preferred by us, how much soever it be neglected among the Greek historians, closed quote, from War Preface 5, Whiston translation. Furthermore, in Antiquities, he also claims to be the voice of truth. Quote, as I proceed, therefore, I shall accurately describe what is contained in our records, in the order of time that belongs to them, for I have already promised to do so throughout this undertaking, and this without adding anything to what is therein contained, or taking away anything therefrom, closed quote, from Antiquities, Preface 3, Whiston translation. If Mason truly believes Josephus is accurate, then he has to account for all the admitted shortcomings, manipulations, and internal disagreement in Josephus. If he truly believes, quote, we ought not to treat Josephus as a kind of fact book, closed quote, then why present any of Josephus's claims as actual history or speak of them in any serious context? And then there are also the above claims and many more by Josephus to contend with. On page 301, Mason concludes, quote, history, therefore, is not simply a matter of reading whatever portrayals of the past happen to survive. It is much more an active enterprise, a kind of detective work requiring the interpreter to try to recreate the past. Such a recreation can only be hypothetical. The historian sets out to develop the hypothesis that will best explain all the available evidence. Strictly speaking, then, there are no historical facts, in the simple sense of self-evident truths about the past, but only hypotheses that range from highly probable to scarcely conceivable, closed quote. This final statement is certainly framed in a way only a professor of humanities can currently justify. Besides the fact that Mason has transformed history from being a noun and literal to being a verb and abstract, this concluding statement is simply not true. History is not conjectural. It's not theory or emotion or opinion. It isn't taught in the way Mason just framed it in grade schools, high schools, or the lauded halls at his own collegiate levels. In these institutions, it is taught as fact, or perhaps in Mason's own humanities course, close enough to fact to regard all else as fanciful. History must be taught in these establishment institutions as solid, literal fact, because by definition, it has to be in order to be regarded as history. This is self-evident. If Mason is correct, then the question persists. Are we being taught actual history or stories someone had to tell? And if it's the second, to serve whom and what motives? If it rained yesterday where I live, there are definite, verifiable ways to historically prove this event beyond reasonable doubt. If there are, let's say, marks on boulders sitting on dry land that only prolonged submersion underwater can cause, that means that boulder was historically underwater at some point. If a certain group currently rules the world, then there were real, objective, historical events and facts that led to that current state. If an historian gets things wrong, they are either incompetent, a deceiver, or their work has been tampered with. If Mason is saying we have to guess and hypothesize concerning those considered pillars of ancient historiography, then they are, as a self-evident truth, unreliable. If they are unreliable, then those who treat them as reliable are either incompetent or deceptive. The only people who want anyone to believe in accidental history are the ones deliberately making history happen, all the while hiding what they do. I don't know that I would take such an issue with this closing statement of Mason's had he just included the most important component. Are we, in fact, working with surviving texts that can be objectively deemed as trustworthy or not? If not, then an honest historian must ask why they are untrustworthy. What events and facts led to them being so? An honest historian cannot simply hypothesize based on bad available materials, but he must expose the faults within those materials. If he does not, he is not an historian at all, but a lying propagandist. This, too, is self-evident. History must be seen as the keeping of accurate details in order to be regarded as history. It must be fact books. Let the reader provide interpretation and hypothesis, and let them defend their own editorials against an accumulation of historical and present facts. But let history and historians present the facts in fact books, and let them and their supporters be held liable when they do not. Let no one call themselves an historian who is not willing to expose lies, errors, and faults, because history is not theory. History, by definition, is the aggregate of all things true that transpired before. Interpretations may be allowed alongside if separate from facts, but history is facts and truth, or else it is not history. And from what I've witnessed from Mason, he is not considering nearly enough of the available self-evident truths and is therefore untrustworthy. OBRY Project Conclusion and Assessment. On page 302, Mason kindly gifts us with the last page of the body of his book. In my penciled notes written on the pages of the book itself, I drew only a frowning face with 2 X's for eyes. Why? Because all that I'm left with after the many hours of reading, underlining, referencing, and thinking is the reinforcement of a certain reality I've known for some time. That is, no one in academia has either the honesty, courage, decency, or intellect to approach and dissect the vastly more important questions. For instance, why and how have we come to the point where an author such as Mason can get away with claiming the self-evidently absurd "there are no historical facts," charging $30 US in the process, taking away part of my life on this journey to nowhere, and not even showing the slightest remorse in the process of establishing what he seems to believe is an inescapable reality? This ending is revolting. I don't say that merely because Mason may believe his conclusions to be justified, as it is possible that many a sincere, though not very bright, intellectual could look at the resources currently available and say similar things were they not thinking it through very well. But I say this because of Mason's apparent nauseating comfort in leaving us here. We, the readers, are like the hitchhiker he picks up. We tell him we want to go to the next town. He, in turn, drives us all over the countryside, makes a number of off-color remarks about us and our family and friends, won't tell us exactly where we are, tells us he's lost too, extracts gas money, and then drops us off at another point in the wilderness and tells us, "This is the best I can do. I'm sure there's a town somewhere. Maybe another car will come along, but thanks anyways for the gas money, sweetheart." Then he's gone, lost to us in the fog far ahead in the distance, and we stand there trying to sort out how that just happened and why. Like the shrewd carney, he hands us 3 bent darts and invites us to lean forward as far as we're able in order to get a better look at our target, while the semi-inflated balloons bob in the breeze like obtuse semantics, nervously indicating our own gullibility. These similitudes of imagery, drawing unsavory comparisons towards Mason, shouldn't be taken as retribution purely over my time misspent, but more as frustration over the fact that Mason appears to be as detached from any emotion regarding the state we are in as he is from a commitment to black and white facts and from the love of finding them. This is my great disappointment. This is why I feel used as just another paying, yet still empty, customer. A Venus flytrap will wither and die if stimulated often enough by a probe with no food upon it, and in the same way we all die a little with each new expectation and subsequent disappointment. All that tedium and destruction of the spirit throughout this book may have even seemed somewhat worthwhile were Mason at least apologetic on behalf of academia for the years stolen from us in pursuit of no historical facts. But if every cloud has a silver lining, I will do my part herein to find this one for my audience. I did find some of Mason's technical work as decent footing for going on in a few directions. I may even, surprisingly, use his bibliography, but unfortunately, though, I have a bad feeling that most of it will be as useful as this book has proven to be. One takeaway that is almost always certain in every literary endeavor is that even dishonest authors can't help but leave contradictory trails of breadcrumbs that, if followed, can often lead us to deeper places than they intended. Even inept authors find themselves occasionally in the bowels of an epiphany. And even if Mason is as irregular and contradictory as Josephus, he still has a number of apparently valid arguments, suggestions, and references which 2 aspirin and a good night's sleep can perhaps make seem fresh and lively. Today, the crescendo of angst, begotten by the way of disappointing academics, has reached fevered highs in the marrow of my being. And I simply don't have patience enough to play the game of compliments as I, and increasing numbers of others, know that there ought to be far more expectation from and pressure on the little g gods of contemporary knowledge. I will say it's plausible, given the current state of beliefs concerning the Bible, that one such as Mason might not see the issues I do. But is it unfair for me to say that if he had seen them and dared to write about them, he couldn't have hoped to get published, most especially by Hendrickson? There are very few redeeming qualities to this book and the ideas perused. In a risk versus benefit assessment, I would say anyone looking for serious Josephine analysis would perhaps do better looking into some of the earlier scholars he cites, such as Folks, Jackson, and Lake, or a few noted German scholars, if any had actually been translated into English. Better yet, read Josephus and his assumed contemporaries for yourself. Read the Bible for yourself. Dig in hard. Make it a lifestyle. But, turning back to the overt subject, one question that shouldn't be lost sight of here is, why does it really matter if Luke is derivative from Josephus or vice versa? The answer should help us to at least understand the significance and contribution of books like Mason's. If Josephus was a real person who just couldn't keep his facts straight, and Luke was a real person and the contemporary of Josephus, then Luke would have to have known of Josephus's reputation as a coward, traitor, bourgeoisie, and one to minimize Christianity. Why would Luke regard him as a good source? What if it were argued that Josephus took information from Luke? Would he not have known the severe disparities between Luke and Matthew/Mark? Why extract characters but change the specifics? Why leave a black hole regarding Jesus and Christianity? Any possibility is fraught with questions that lead to answers damaging any sort of credibility of both sources. The answer to the question, why does it really matter? Or perhaps more appropriately, what significance is it if these sources are found out to indeed be frauds? Is found in what these two works appear to be attempting to achieve. 1. The validation of religion, philosophy, and spirituality over the historical, ethnological, and practical aspects of the law and prophets, i.e. the Old Testament. 2. The validation of apocryphal/establishment history over the repetitive and specific prophecies in the law and prophets. And 3, invalidation of the promises of blessing or curse of Deuteronomy 28 and Leviticus 26. So, if the Old Testament at least is true and accurate, then these types of works, such as Josephus and those who popularize and curate them, are working to an end of keeping the real, authentic Israel and Judah in ignorance of their own identity. True Israel and Judah are then perpetually positioned in servitude beneath these people and the impostors posing as Israel, Judah. Because these are the potential stakes, I believe this superficial sort of intellectualism must become an object of vicious ridicule, for starters. Playing with the items of history, as Mason and the majority of other academics do, as though they were participating in a leisurely game of golf, is simply resupporting the egregious structures of the present. This counts as true whether they mean to do this or not by default. This pernicious way of thinking affects our children's future, our families' well-beings, and the health of the whole world. This is why all academics must be held seriously accountable for what they do or do not do. They are as accountable as the politician, industrialist, banker, or clergyman. If they refuse to criticize all aspects of the past, they are the establishment of the present and cannot be trusted. To lie about history is perjury on the world. To defend the liars of history is to provide aid and comfort to the enemy and obstruct a criminal investigation. It really is, at the level of basic truth, just that black and white. Now, do I believe your $30 is entirely wasted if you bought this book? Not entirely, I suppose. And many out there more sharply astute than John of the OBRY Project may find room for all manner of intellectual exercises from the material Mason does provide. Do I think the book's title is appropriate? No. A more appropriate title might be All the Reasons to Read and Revere Josephus while simultaneously highlighting and ignoring all the reasons to regard him as just the worst historical source with a bit of New Testament, specifically Luke Acts, peppered in for flavor. But that title is why no one will hire me as a book titleist. I realize that I set the bar very high, the ridge of which is called the truth in every way with emotion. Some may think I'm asking too much, but am I really? Maybe we've just become far too accustomed to getting too little. We have the intellectual disposition of a Dickens-style orphan. Academia scoops a pittance of non-nutritious gruel into our bowl. We unthinkingly devour it and then come scurrying back. "Please, sir, may I have some more?" Even worse, we are the Venus flytrap killed by way of empty stimuli. And we never could afford to trifle with bland, no sure answer academics. And today, the stakes are increasing quickly. I assume Mason will be remembered as part of the cadre of wiki academics who consciously work against the law and prophets of the God of Jacob, Israel, and the truth in general. And Josephus will be remembered as one of the greatest literary assaults on the Bible ever produced. And even if Mason is just an honest but misguided academic, I'm still positive I'd rather be remembered for a standard that was excessively high and impassioned than one that was lukewarm and mediocre, entirely devoid of emotion, life, and the suffering born out of the love of the truth. I am Jonathan McTemus, and that concludes another OBRY project.